committing these crimes as opposed to an individual. And so I think in terms of the state, it may not be necessary to discover specific motive, but more broad policy, political ambitions, perhaps, an intention on the part of the state to achieve certain goals. And then the question then is, how are those goals achieved and in what way? Then, of course, you look at if you were considering an individual, which I don't believe is the case here, I mean, then you would have to actually talk about an actual knowledge or desire to bring about the outcomes that constitute the elements of the crime.
So might it be possible for an alleged perpetrator to have a particular goal, say assimilation, and a particular motive, for instance, eradication of terrorism or economic development, but at the same time not intend to destroy a group or even intend to commit any crime?
Yes, I think that is possible.
You will be aware that in the Packer Diamond report to the tribunal and the New Lines report, the associated New Lines report, there is a view that destroy must mean something more than intent to physically or biologically destroy, notwithstanding some of the jurisprudence in this area. Are you of the same view?
I think it's just, to me, a matter of difference of emphasis rather than any substantive disagreement. I think when we talked about destruction, destruction can come in different forms and it can be expressed in different ways. So I would say that it's, again, that preponderance of a wide range of different activities that are undertaken in order to achieve what we would consider to be destruction.
I'll put a question to you which I put to Professor Packer. Would you rule out an intent to socially or culturally destroy a group? And if you wouldn't, what would be the jurisprudential basis for such a view?
Well, I go back to what I said earlier about the attempt to erase a particular people group. And certainly social and cultural identities of the group are part and parcel of that group. And so I would say that attempting to eradicate those can be viewed in conjunction with other activities or other actions as an attempt to destroy.
The various legal opinions relating to alleged genocide in Xinjiang suggest at least that a substantial part of the Uyghurs are being targeted in Xinjiang. The jurisprudence indicates that the starting point is the numbers, but qualitative factors may also be relevant when determining a substantial part. My question is, are the allegations being made in respect of Xinjiang there in terms of the numbers? And if not, what other factors may be relevant?
I think it's not just a question of pure numbers, although from what I have read and heard, the numbers themselves are quite large in terms of population being subjected to restrictions and other limitations of their liberty. To me, substantial could also be qualitative in nature, in the sense that, for example, if you were to identify or single out leaders, whether they be religious leaders, cultural leaders, political leaders, whether they be intellectual leaders, thought shapers, that sort of thing. These would also constitute, I think, a substantial group of people in the context of their ability to carry the heritage and carry the traditions of that particular people group, and also to be, in a sense, holders of the heritage of that group.
Clarify for us that destruction in substantial part is part of the intent requirement. So it is not actually necessary to destroy a substantial part, but simply that the perpetrator has an intent to destroy a substantial part.
Well, I think one has to look at how, if there is, for example, a policy that is in place, how that policy is being implemented or given effect, and whether or not it involves targeting, as I said earlier, key leaders, people who are the holders of cultural and social traditions and practices, people who, in a sense, embody or represent the identity of that people group.
As you are aware, the tribunal is considering both individual responsibility for crimes and state responsibility. Can you explain whether a state can commit a crime and how exactly according to the jurisprudence?
Well, I would be hesitant to say that a state can commit a crime, but in terms of state responsibility, I would say that there are, in international law, obligations placed on states as a result of treaties that they have entered into and treaty obligations that they have therefore taken upon themselves. And either by way of omission of the obligations of that treaty, or commission of things which are in violation of that treaty, I think then you could say that the state is responsible. And I think in shorthand, people may say that the state has committed a crime, although strictly speaking, that would not be accurate.
So in attributing responsibility to a state for a crime, would you say that you require an individual?
I think the short answer is yes. I think there have to be organs or officials of the state that are implementing the policy or the laws that have been passed by the state. And it is in implementing and the way in which those policies are being implemented. If they were to, as a result of that, end up in the commission of crimes, then the individual may himself or herself be responsible, but it is also the attribution of responsibility over that person by way of perhaps command or control that would allow the state to be attributed to the commission of those acts. Yes.
And just by way of clarification, are you able to explain to us how specific intent might be identified in relation to individuals and how you then might attribute that to the state?
Well, if you are looking at the individual, then I believe that the individual has to satisfy the specific intent, has to perhaps understand what he is doing or her, the nature and the effect of the acts that he or she is carrying out, whether by himself or in furtherance of state policy.
Two more questions, if I may. Can you provide some clarification about what we mean when we talk about state responsibility in terms of genocide or crimes against humanity? So just to be more specific, what is the difference between attributing a crime to a state and then the duties arising under treaties or customary international law relating to, for instance, prevention, the duty to prohibit, the duty to punish, or the duty to enact legislation?
Well, can I take the second part first? I mean, so as I mentioned a little earlier, that is the obligations taken on by a state as a result of that state entering into international treaties and taking on board the obligations set out under specific treaties. So that in most cases will entail prohibiting such acts, criminalizing such acts, implementing laws or promulgating laws to prevent such acts from happening, and then to punish people who commit those acts. And then also we could talk about elements of remedy and perhaps compensation. So that would be on the state. But the state also has, as I said, policies, and the policies have to be carried out. And these are carried out by individuals acting in compliance with directives from the state or other bodies that are associated with the state. And if those individuals also then commit atrocities, then I would say that their acts can be attributed to the state.
Thank you. You might not have had a chance to see the discussion with Professor Packer. There was a discussion around standards of proof. My question is, what standard of proof would you say is ordinarily applied under international law to state attribution of crimes?
From my reading of the law, there doesn't appear to be one single standard of proof in terms of how we attribute responsibility to the state, or what standard to measure a state's complicity in this matter. I think I read somewhere that there could be quite a lot of different interpretations. So I suppose that's not terribly helpful. But to me, I think what the tribunal perhaps might consider doing is looking at the overall picture, and to look at different policies, different practices, which in themselves perhaps may not necessarily point to a sufficient degree of culpability, but when taken together and seen as a whole, ends up building a picture, an overall picture, whereby one can see very clearly how state policy is being implemented in a way that results in acts of genocide.
And my final question is that at the ICJ, in the two seminal cases related to genocide, the view was that the very highest standards must be applied in attributing the crime of genocide to the state. So that was then later elaborated to suggest that beyond reasonable doubt would be an appropriate standard. Would you encourage, as Professor Packer and Mr. Diamond did, the tribunal in applying a different standard for the reasons they gave and for the reasons of the particular circumstances in which allegedly Uyghurs find themselves in Xinjiang?
I believe Messrs. Packer and Diamond used the phrase clear and convincing evidence. And as you say, their understanding is that this is something beyond reasonable doubt. I think again, it may be a question of degree as to what you mean by beyond reasonable doubt and clear and convincing evidence. And I would say that I would look really at the preponderance of evidence that is available to the tribunal and to use that as a guide to coming to a decision.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koo. I imagine the panel have a number of questions for you. Thank you.
Mr. Koo, first of all, by way of full disclosure, you and I first met when you were appointed to the China tribunal that I chaired, investigating forced organ harvesting. That produced its judgment on the 17th of June of 2019 and signed off its written detailed judgment early in 2020. Since then, we've maintained light social contact, but haven't discussed this matter at all until the moment when you were asked, either possibly by me or probably by Mr. Hamid Sabi, to be the a legal expert. Is that correct?
Yes, Sir Jeffrey, that is correct.
And the reason that you were asked, as you know, is that the sanctions implied by the People's Republic of China on various people, including this tribunal, had the effect of making the United Kingdom lawyers and others unavailable to us, and you were good enough, at my request through Mr. Sabi, to agree to help us, careless of such things as might have affected the United Kingdom bar.
Yes, no, that is true. I run a small practice which doesn't extend to very broad international commercial work. And so I don't think the consequence, if any, of anything that the PRC might do to me, at least from a commercial point of view, would put me out too much.
We're very grateful to you for your assistance. I'm going to leave as much as possible of the time allocated to my colleagues for reasons that will become clear. But first of all, and a very simple question, given the real audience for this proceedings, what is jurisprudence?
Come again, is that your question? What is jurisprudence?
Yeah, what is jurisprudence?
At one level, it's the principles underlying the law. It's legal philosophies that inform how laws ought to be made or how laws ought to be implemented. It is also it also extends to discussions about the law, how the law was or is or ought to be. And it's a discussion about decisions that have been made and the reasonings and the rationale underpinning or underlying those judgments. So it's a collective term of quite a lot of discussion and debate about what the law is or ought to be.
No criticism and every gratitude to you for being able to answer questions that embody such a huge amount of learning, but it's pretty unlikely, isn't it, that the concept of or the content of legal jurisprudence is going to be known to the average non-expert educated citizen around the world?
Quite possibly. It's not something that an average person would necessarily think about in his or her 9-to-5 job.
Be tolerant of the following remark, not of course directed at you in any way, but the following light-hearted remark, that the law and jurisprudence has provided quite a nice playground for lawyers and judges since the start of the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda in 1993.
You use the word playground, you know. I suppose I suppose that is the light-hearted comment that you are making. I think there is a lot of discussion about this area because the whole area of international criminal law has traversed different issues over the years, and I think lawyers and judges and other interested parties are keen to try and work out whether or not there can be a broad and systematic approach to dealing with these different emanations of criminal law by the use of perhaps a set of standards that could be universally applied. And that's where I think the discussion and the debate has centered around.
We find from the, well, first of all, another prefatory remark. You possibly know that it was only John Packer and his colleague who were good enough to stand behind their reports in front of this tribunal, and the other three, is it Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and Essex Court Chambers, didn't. And the American analysis for the American government analysis of their finding of genocide has also not been publicly authored or indeed publicly articulated. So Packer was on his own and the others haven't appeared. Is that about right?
I don't have a very detailed knowledge of that, but I assume that to be the case, yes.
But just reading their reports, it's clear that there are differences of opinion.
I suppose there are. I don't think you can put a whole group of lawyers into a room and get everybody to agree on everything. But I think we are all trying to work out, I mean, some of the key issues, which I suppose will exercise the tribunal as well, is things like the scope of the crime, the applicability of the law, what will constitute a commission of that crime, what will constitute sufficient evidence, what is the level of proof that needs to be ascertained in coming to a conclusion. And I think, I suppose in any one of those areas, there could well be some disagreement as to the approach that needs to be taken.
Mr. Koo, I'm now going to explain why I'm going to leave nearly all of the remaining time to my colleagues. Drawing such analogy as is appropriate between this tribunal and a jury in a criminal trial. A jury in a criminal trial making a decision about crime has to be directed in straightforward terms that can be as understood by them as the person sitting in the public gallery watching the trial.
Yes, and so yeah, I suppose the question then is who is giving that direction?
And well, in a jury trial, it's the judge. And so far as this group of 9 individuals composing the tribunal, we're looking for an individual or body of individuals. It might be you in combination with counsel, it might be you in combination with the opinions in some way synthesized. We're looking for a straightforward direction in law that could be as understood by us and as understood by the public and as understood by the PRC. And so what I'm going to do, Mr. Koo, is almost immediately ask my colleagues to ask their concerns and questions, and then perhaps to invite you and maybe counsel to see if you can prepare for us in writing, probably a straightforward direction that can be published. Would you be prepared to cooperate with that as an exercise?
Yes, it would be my pleasure to do so.
Because the word genocide was in abeyance between 1948 and 1993. There's been the suggestion that the convention was activated in respect of decisions made about the Kurds a little earlier in the 90s, or the late 80s, but even that is not clear. When it started to be used, it started then to be used by members of the public in describing atrocities about which they were particularly concerned. The public are using this term, and parliamentarians are using this term now about the Uyghurs' treatment. but they're not able to use it in a very simple way if they follow the jurisprudence, because the jurisprudence is muddled. Would you accept that?
Well, I think if we were to reflect, I think one of the reasons perhaps why there was an absence of focus in genocide, as you say, between 1948 and perhaps in the 1990s, was the fact that we were not necessarily looking at large-scale wars or atrocities that were happening, and it's perhaps incidents after the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakup of Eastern Europe, that led to warfare between states and armies, that we began to once again see these atrocities being committed. But again, these were atrocities that were primarily committed in the context of a war, and I think it might be easier, in inverted commas, for an average person to understand atrocities committed in the context of war, and to understand genocide from that perspective. I think when it comes to a slow form of genocide that takes many years, it takes incremental actions on the part of a state and its organs to bring about a destruction of a people group, that might be a little bit more challenging from many different angles as to how one could still say that genocide was happening. And I suppose the development
at the level of proof beyond reasonable doubt. That's the way we can show respect and save the PRC from unfairness. And would you agree that it would also most likely fit with the general public view of what genocide is?
I think the phrase beyond reasonable doubt is etched in the collective mind of the public, having watched far too many American courtroom dramas, and so that formulation is something that people on balance would have heard of, and I suppose given that it's a criminal trial, then I think people would understand that. The challenge is when you move from an individual to the state, how do you prove beyond reasonable doubt vis-a-vis a state, and whether the state has a mind that directs its actions? And so we have to draw parallels to what would be the mind of the state when it comes to attributing or at least saying that there was a criminal intent. I think that's where the challenge is for the average person.
But if, and I'm going to make this my last question, and I'll come back only if there's time with one or two others, but if the tribunal elected to say it would not find genocide against the state unless it found in an individual with power in the state the genocidal intent, then it could be sure it was not being unfair to the People's Republic of China.
Yes, I would agree with you.
Have to ask. No. Mr. Vetch. Oh, yes, there are some.
Thank you for your attendance today. So I'd like to talk about joint criminal enterprise and where that stands with respect to individual responsibility as against state responsibility. So if with joint criminal enterprise there is a substantial number of people perhaps in positions of state power, provincial or otherwise, and that's, they have positions of decision-making power, if that's quite substantial, does that then become like the state? What I'm trying to get at, can you have both frameworks operating together?
I think the short answer is you can. But I think in terms of this, if you're talking about a criminal act amongst individuals, then joint enterprise would be where people come together and conspire with each other to achieve a certain criminal outcome. And therefore, there has to be a degree of communication, collaboration, and active partnership, as it were. You may not be a partner in the whole thing. You may be only a partner in some of that, but it's along a chain, as it were, that results in the commission of a criminal activity. And so, I suppose the challenge with that, in terms of the state and the individual, is that there may be no such evidence of that kind of active collaboration or partnership. I'm thinking in particular of an individual, perhaps who receives a directive from a state organ or a particular state a body to implement this particular policy. And the question is, by following orders and by implementing those policies, do you actually get a joint criminal enterprise? I think there would be those who would say that may not be correct. So then, if I look at, as you say, certain individuals, you have to ask, and I've been thinking about this for a while, you have to ask whether these people can be said to be, in a sense, the alter ego to the state, that they are in some ways the state. The state being this corporate entity. There's no one individual that necessarily represents the state. But in certain cases, and especially true of perhaps authoritarian regimes, there may be certain individuals whose thoughts, whose speeches, whose directives take on in a sense, the authority or the imprimatur of the state. And if therefore he, or if it's more than one person, they, in a sense, sing the same tune, as it were, in terms of what policies are and how they should be implemented, then I think you can say that there is, that would be the criminality, as it were, or the evidence of criminality of the state, without necessarily invoking the idea of a joint criminal enterprise.
Professor, Mr. Koo, I'm going to, at the moment, ration one question each per member so that we can get the questions out that they're going to want you and maybe the council team to help with in the formulation of a document to advise us. Mr. Vetch, please, one question.
Would it be fair to say that the allegations as made against the PRC in contemplation of genocide are very different from any that have been considered by a formal court, the conventional jurisprudence, since the establishment of the convention? In other words, it is very different, for instance, from Rwanda or Bosnia, and therefore the latitude or the scope for disagreement by lawyers may well be wider, and therefore, in a sense, the tramlines for this tribunal are wider. Is that fair and reasonable?
Very briefly, short answer, yes. as I was saying to Sir Geoffrey in our exchange earlier, I mean, it may be very different, or we may need to see things in a slightly different way or perspective when we are talking of a situation where there is an allegation of genocide outside the context of an outright war or armed conflict. And so I would say that not so much the latitude, but perhaps the way in which we would look at what would constitute evidence of culpability would need to be different.
One question. I mean, you can
Yes,
all come
I'm
back
going to
into
respect that. I suspect in this thing I may inadvertently, in which case I apologise, trip into two. But Mr. Koo, thank you. In relation to intent, which is clearly, as you say, one of the key issues here, to what degree can you deduce intent from the acts themselves, the facts that there are particular offences contemplated, for example, by the Genocide Convention, actually take place in a state? And in a state which a number of witnesses have said to us is opaque in its structure and its decision-making, to what extent do you have to identify individuals in that, rather than simply relying on the fact that these events have taken place and coming to a conclusion that those could not have taken place in any state of this kind of structure unless relevant people, without identifying individuals, could have promulgated them or at least supported them?
I would tend to agree with the second part of your question, that it may not be necessary to identify particular individuals, but to take note of the fact that these things have occurred and that these things would not have occurred had it not been for certain policies, laws, regulations, or practices that were incumbent upon the individual to carry out. And it is the existence of those policies or programs that would need to be tested against the idea of whether or not there was intent.
Professor Manju now? No. Yes, Professor, Dame Pavian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koo. Lots of points to consider here. In terms of genocide, we have got a lot of evidence that people are disappearing, but we haven't got the, I suppose crudely say, we haven't got the bodies to show for it. How much corroborative evidence do we need or not need to say that there is a genocide going on? In this particular time, I know there are other areas that we could think about.
I agree with you. It's quite challenging, and there may well not be sufficient evidence to prove that genocide has happened because of the disappearance of people. But the fact that people have disappeared, having gone through the system of incarceration, and so in a sense, their final presence was within the control of particular authorities, and then they were no longer seen after that, could be indicative of enforced disappearance or some form of murder. But yes, we will never be able to prove that 100%. But then the whole idea of genocide is not necessarily to look at every particular criminal act and say, is there proof of genocide in this case or in that case? But sometimes we have to look at the totality of the evidence when compared to other acts, and to ask ourselves whether or not there is some form of a program that overall encompasses all these different elements. And it's that preponderance of all that evidence when seen together, that could lead the tribunal to come to a conclusion in relation to whether or not genocide has occurred.
I'm interested in Sir Geoffrey's notion of unfairness to the state of China, and the question that if we were elected to say we wouldn't find against the state unless we found against an individual, we could be sure we weren't being unfair, and I believe you agreed with that. But we also, if I understand correctly, it is possible to arrive at a view without citing individuals on the preponderance of the evidence. So how would we, or should we, establish, if we were doing that we were not being unfair to the state of China? Is that even possible?
Well, I think the proposition that Sir Geoffrey put to me was that if the tribunal decided that in trying to be fair to China, that they would not, that they would want to have proof of individual guilt of an individual, was that something that could be done? And I suppose the answer is yes. It is for the tribunal to decide how it wishes to arrive at a decision. I would say that would be particularly challenging because from some of the sessions that I've heard, right, there has been no particular reference to any one individual who is alleged to have done this or done that. And I think some of the opinions that have been given have expressed this in the context of high-level political leaders, and to me, that's something then that you would have to look at as well, as to whether or not the evidence that has been given to the tribunal actually has proven that those high-level individuals are individually culpable. So I would prefer, or I would suggest that looking at or returning to the concept of state responsibility might be a more productive approach to this whole issue, in which case then one would rely on the preponderance of evidence. And to be fair to the PRC, one would have to see that preponderance of evidence. And not just look at very isolated incidents or statements, but to see and to ensure that there was sufficiently wide and robust evidence proving those state policies and interpretations of how this is to be done, and statements about political aims and outcomes that the state desired from those policies.
Mr. Koo, we're into round 2, I think, with 10 minutes left, so I'm going to make my question in round 2 extremely short. The Packer report seems to allow for the fact that once you've identified your standard of proof, you can nevertheless reduce it because the evidential issue is difficult. You don't have evidence. It's difficult to get evidence. Thus, you lower your standard of proof. If you may note it if you've heard that session that I expressed disagreement with that. Do you accept that once you've set a standard of proof, you shouldn't reduce it simply because the evidential problem makes it difficult to reach it?
Yes, I think once you have set a standard, I think you should stick to it.
I'm going to race through things. I expect Professor Cora's got something else. Make it quick if you can.
Okay, I'd like to talk about the standing of a people's tribunal. As you know, the main reason why this was set up is because legal avenues were not possible. So whatever decision we come to at the end of the tribunal, are there any, what are further legal possibilities, number one, and number two, can this somehow be made into a legal avenue? Are there precedents, or can there be some creative ways forward?
I think at best, the decision or the judgment of the tribunal will have moral weight, not necessarily legal one. Because if one were to say, well, the tribunal has come to this particular conclusion and we take it to a court, the court will say, well, no, in our processes, we'll have to rehear all the evidence and come to a finding of our own. They would not merely accept the decision of the tribunal and say, well, it's done and dusted, it's proven, we can then move on. So I think the authority of the tribunal's decision, as I said, lies more in the moral sphere, where given the way in which, but just because I'm saying it's moral, I'm not saying that it lacks authority, because of the way in which the tribunal has gone about hearing the evidence, inviting people to come before it to offer evidence. I think the scope of the evidence and the richness of the evidence that is presented before the tribunal gives weight to any outcome or finding that the tribunal may have, and then that itself can then be used for further activity and advocacy on the part of individuals interested in taking this further.
Mr. Fetch.
Can I just explore Article 2 with you, please? So the preamble to Article 2 includes the words, with intent to destroy. What it does not say, with intent to physically destroy. My understanding is there is jurisprudence that suggests that it should do. The question is, well, that's a statement and a question. Is it true to say that the various acts, the 5 acts, A to E, can be dealt with separately, i.e. each individual one can be sufficient as a matter of fact to achieve a determination of genocide, assuming that the intent was there? If that is the case, why would, for instance, the words in Article C be included where the words physical destruction are included? And I accept that there's a difference between the intent and the act, but nonetheless, you might think that if it was intended that physical destruction was the only way, then it would have been included in the preamble.
Mr. Vetch, I think if you read the jurisprudence, I think there is also a body of thinking that the reference to physical is only in the context of where the word physical actually appears. So, for example, in C, where there's mention of physical destruction, then yes, then that you have to meet that definition. Has there been physical destruction? But in terms of all the others, there may not necessarily be a need to have physical destruction. I don't think you would necessarily have to read the words physical into what they call the chapeau of Article 2, because it's not there, and there's no reason to read physical into those words. And your other question, the way Article 2 is framed is genocide means any any of the following acts. It's not every act. It's so any one. So if you can say for if there is sufficient evidence that any one of those acts has been committed, then you can come to a finding of genocide if it fits within the intention to destroy.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr. Jeffrey. So, just to reinforce the point then, if you looked at Clause B of Article 2, where it says causing serious bodily or mental harm, and there is an or there, then by definition, unless there's mass suicide, it's unlikely that the mental harm is going to result in the physical destruction. Is that correct?
Yes, and the point is that mental harm doesn't, you don't necessarily have to have physical destruction. Yeah. Mental harm by its very nature is perhaps non-physical in that sense.
You've answered that very helpfully.
Sorry, this point I think is just more of a clarification and where we've got to in the discussion. In relation to the standard of proof, as I understand it, the tribunal on advice there's no prescribed standard of proof. We can look at preponderance of evidence, we can look at reasonable doubt. And coming back to the point that Jeffrey made about the need, which all of us agree with, to treat China with respect and fairness, if we decided on a level of proof, having taken your advice and listened to experts, that was different from beyond reasonable doubt, that would still be acceptable.
Yes, that would be acceptable. Correct.
Professor
Thank you very much, Sir Jeffrey. This is a people's tribunal, and obviously there are a lot of lay people like myself on it. But from a lay point of view, and indeed a scientific point of view, one always likes to hear two sides of an argument. Now, in this case, and one has been fair, one has invited the PRC on several occasions to take part. In a court of law, is the fact that one side is not producing any evidence or lack of evidence considered as being deleterious to the argument, in that they either might be hiding something or just not wanting to take part? How does a court of law look at that? I mean, we talked about intent, and we've talked about a standard of evidence, and we've talked about the proof. Can one come to a conclusion with the absence of one party?
The short answer is yes, you can. But it would have to be done with extreme caution. And in a criminal trial, it would be the case that the judge, in some ways, would try to ensure that the evidence, the presentation of the evidence, and the arguments of the prosecution would be fair to the accused. And so the judge may perhaps be seen to be perhaps stepping in sometimes on behalf of the accused to ensure that there is a level playing field, given the fact that the accused is not there, and that you are still proceeding with the trial in absentia, as it were. So, I mean, courts can do that. They are doing that. For example, the court a court in the Netherlands at the moment is hearing evidence about the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines MH17, and the accused persons are not there. But then it becomes incumbent then upon the bench, as it were, to ensure that there is as level a playing field as possible. And this may sometimes involve them intervening on behalf of the absent accused in order to make sure that there is procedural fairness.
Thank you very much. Mr. Q, you've been extremely helpful. I happen to know that you've made yourself available despite being heavily involved in the very significant difficulties that your own country is going through at the moment, which no doubt engage the skills and position that you hold, so we are doubly grateful to you. I think you will have understood from the questions that the tribunal will be most assisted by a straightforward statement or direction of the law that not only us, but everyone else can understand who is dealing with the question, I suppose, the conceptual question of the visitor to the PRC, if allowed to visit, standing there and saying to herself or himself, am I now in a country where the country is committing genocide? It's sort of as simple as that, complicated though it may be. And I hope the questions haven't deterred you from your earlier agreement to work with our team of lawyers in producing such a statement or direction.
Not at all, Sir Geoffrey.
Well, thank you for all of us. That's it for the time being, but I'm afraid we will be prevailing on your time a bit more, but in written form probably. Thank you. Anything, Mr. Sabi?
Thank you, Mr. Hu. Our next witness...
Before your next witness, I just wanted to, and it rises almost most appropriately in light of what Mr. Koo was answering just now, and it needs to be made clear to the public, as well as to the People's Republic of China, that following a press conference by the ambassador here, I think it was, making various remarks about the tribunal, which it's not necessary to comment on, but also apparently itemizing ways in which the tribunal evidence was wholly incorrect, without giving details as to the nature of the errors. You wrote to the ambassador yesterday, well, it had to be yesterday because there was no way of getting the letter to the tribunal over the weekend effectively. And you referred to earlier correspondence where you had invited the People's Republic of China to attend the hearings. You observed that it had been stated at the opening of the hearings that Council didn't have a case for or against the People's Republic of China, and you said it's only duty, that's the tribunal, as mandated by the tribunal, this is you, is to present the evidence that is publicly available or provided by any interested party, including your government. Our researchers have searched for both inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. At the request of the chair of the tribunal, I hereby invite you once again to attend the hearings of the tribunal, which will continue until the close of business on Monday, the 13th of September. You may present to the tribunal the evidence that your government believes supports its case, and also provide the tribunal the background and substance for allegations that the evidence so far submitted to the tribunal is fabricated. Have you received any acknowledgement to that or reply to that letter?
No, sir. The letter was posted yesterday, but before that we put it as an open letter on social media so Chinese government can see it. As I have explained, there is no possibility of directly delivering that to the Chinese embassy. They would not accept delivery by hand. They would not provide an email address where you can send these statements. And the only way to send this letter to the Chinese government is through normal mail, which wouldn't have got there by today. So we made an open letter and published it.
And there is no one here today representing the People's Republic of China.
I assume not.
Next witness, please.
Tövende bugünkü ikinci
Good morning, Mr.
guvaçımız çıkıdı.
Good morning.
Gutman
Ethan Goodman
efendi.
is an award-winning China analyst and human rights investigator.
Gutman efendi
He's a senior research
Xitay'daki
fellow
insan
in
hakları
China studies at
ve
victims of communism
Xitay
Memorial
hakkındaki
Foundation
tetkikat
and a co-founder
üstüde
of International Coalition to End
uzun
Transplant Abuse in
tetkikatlarını
China.
yapılan.
His research focuses
Onunki tetkikatı
on surveillance and organ harvesting. Mr. Goodman
Xitay'daki
has authored two books,
nazaretçilik ve
Losing the New
insanlarınki
and
içki
Slaughter, Mass Killing of Organ Harvesting,
organlarını
China's secret solution to its dissident problems.
eliş qatarlıq tədqiqatlar bilan qıldı, işləydi. O Amerika, Avropa Parlamenti və başqa nurgun orunlarda bu haqda köp guvalıq bəgən.
Organ harvesting cluster in Aksu. He has previously submitted a report in the first hearing in
Yaqında
June,
Gutman efendi özününki yeni tayarlagan tədqiqat materiallarını
Mr. Goodman,
yollab bəgən. Gutman efendi sizge 10 minut vaqt verildi. Mümkün bolsa bu PowerPoint-ni içib bəgən bolsаңlar.
So you'll have to pay attention to me. Let you know. Thank you for inviting me to testify for a second time.
Meni təklif qılğanlar üçün köp rəhmət. Bu ikinci qətim bu kelişim. Sirtdən suallar kəlsə nəyət yaxşı bulatdı. Qani körəmiz keləmdikən məmnun uqmayman, lekin sot içidiki suallar bilul əlbəttə mən onunla təyyamən cavab verişkə. Aldın qətimqi bəgən məlumatımğa asasən bu qətim qısqartılıb və yeni qoşulğanlarını qoşub sizlərə report verməkçə. Mən nəyət qısqa qılıb bu məsələlərini sizlərə düşündürməkçə. Meninki bu tədqiqatım keyinki vaqtlarda şu köçməllərini ziyaret qilish bilan bo'lgan. Ular yana Aqsudan kelgan bir ispatçınınki ziyaretimdə görə 1980-yillarninki keyində Xitay hökuməti tərəfindən adamların içki əzalarını eliş başlanğan 90-yillarda Ürümçidə bolğan 1994-cü ilmi Anvar Toxta əpəndi özü qatnaşqan, yəni bu cinayətçilərini atqandan keyin onun içki əzalarını eliş qatnaşqan 1997-ci ili G'ulji vaqəsindən keyin siyasi cinayetçi bo'lgan Uyg'urlarninki ichki a'zolari ham elingan. G'ulji va Urumchida bundaq vaqalar ko'p bo'lgan. 1999-yili Falun Gong murtlarininki taxminan 2 milliondan oshiq Falun Gong murtlari turmalarda bo'lgan. Bularninki ichki a'zolari Xitay hökuməti tərəfindən elingan, moyun boğaları, öpkisi, böğrüki, cigiri degəndəklə elingan. 2002-ci ili çətəllik şu içki əzalığı muhtaç boğanlar kelib özlərinin kerekliklərini alğan. Keyinki vaxtlarda Tibet və Xristiyan murtlarının mı oxşaş içki əzalarını elingan. 2007-ci ili Xitay hükümet doktorxanası tərəfindən yılığa 10 mingdən oşuq içki əzalarını başqalarına ötkəb bəgən. 2022-ci ili 60 mingdən oşuq içki əzalar almashtırılğan. Yəni nurgun şəxsi doktorxanalar qurulğan. Onundan keyinki vaqtlarda təxəddüm tərəqqi qılıb, şu Falun Gong murtlarınki qan tərkibini sorash qatarlıqlar bilan, yəni tayyorlik qilgan. Yaqinqi yillardan buyon Uyg'ur va qozoqlarninki DNA qan tiplariga asosan ichki a'zolarini elayotidu. Onundan boshqa shu qayta tarbiyalash o'rinlaridagi odamlarning hammasiga gumonliq qaralsak bo'ldi. 2017-yili inson ichki haqlarining ichki a'zolarini maqsud to'shiydigan airportlarda alohida bir yo'l bo'lgan. 2018-yili Şinjan Uyghur Abdunur rayonidagi yoki Sharq Turkistondagi
the first completed crematorium, which is near Urumqi, hires 50 Han Chinese security guards. 2020,
maxsus mushu Uyghur jinoyatchilar bayada 50dan oshiq nimalar turdi ekan, saqchilar nima nazorat qilib turdi ekan, ham bu yerdagi Uyg'urlarningki ichki a'zolarini oldigan bir o'rinlar bor. Hozir men PowerPointni ochib bersanglar, men sizlarga shu PowerPointdagi asarlar, suratlar orqali ko'rsatmoqchi. Men bu yerga kelay hozir. Mening oldingi qatimqi sizlarga bergan guvohchiligimda bu ichki a'zolarni oldigan o'rinni, ya'ni Aqsudagi bir o'rin haqida so'zlagan edim. Masalan, bu yoqdagi ikki qayta tarbiyalash o'rni haqida men o'rnimdan turib tushundisam bo'lamdi degan bo'ldi, ammo mikrofon bilan bo'lmay qolamdi dedi. Bu birsida 30 ming, yana birsida 16 ming, jami taxminan 50 mingdek odam bor bularning ichida tarbiyalanayotgan. Bu birinchi kamp, ikkinchi kamp, bu kampningki ichida bu bir doktorxona bor. Bu shu kampning ichiga joylashgan doktorxona Aqsudagi. Bu o'ng tarafdan, janub va shimol tarafdan chiqishlari. Burun kamp mushundaq bo'lgan, ammo keyin kamp yangi qismi bu qo'shilgan tarbiyalash markazi. Bu köydirdigan o'liklarni bir taraf qildigan o'rin, jasad köydirdigan o'rin. Bundaq bir o'rinlashtirishniki boshqa tushuntirish yo'li yo'q herhalde bu yerda.
Assistance is coming your way, I think, in the form of a handheld mic. If you turn to your right, Mr. Goodman.
Agar o'rningiz qaytib ketsangiz, sizga yordam keldi. Shuni orqali tushuntirib bo'ldi. Ko'p rahmat.
So we have two re-education camps.
Biz mushu bir yerda ikki tarbiyalash markazi va yanda bir doktorxona bor. Birinchi doktorxona shu birinchi tarbiyalash markazininki ichida. Bu jasad ko'ydirish o'rni. Buningda biz qarasak, maxfiy keldigandek bir yo'l bordek ko'ralaymiz, ya'ni udilkagini bo'lgan. Ham bu odam jasad ko'ydirish o'rni Aqsu daryosiga yaqin bir yerda.
Slow down a minute. Not all of us are crematorium experts. Water-based.
Alkaline hydrolysis is
Biz jasad ko'ydirishninki o'rniniki haqida yaxshi tushunmaymiz, bir tushuntirish bergan bo'lsang, jasad ko'ydirish o'rni qanday bo'ldi desa, uni suvlash kerak va shu ko'ydirgandan keyin bir taraf qilib ko'p bir nimalar bo'lish kerak, ya'ni keraklik narsalar. Bu yerga qaraydigan bo'lsanglar, buni men maxsus tadqiqotchilar orqali mulohaza qildim. Ammo bu yerda bir ko'ydigandan keyin bir taraf qilish turbi yo'llari bo'lgan bo'lishi mumkin. Bu faqat bir gumon. Men tafsilroq tushuntirish kelsak, bu yerdagi mushu qizil ko'rsatgan o'rin,
including the crematorium and the camps.
Shu jasad ko'ydirish o'rnininki nimasi ham shu yoqdan shu ceset köydürüş orni ve şu terbiyeleş kursudan Aksu Airport'a beriş aydırımga beriş için tahminen 20 minut 30 minutça vaqt ketidi. Aksu Airport aydırımızda adamlarninki şu içki organlarını taşıydıganга alayda maxsus yeşil yol açılgan. Sen şu toğrusida birer nima resimlerin barmı? Sen degen aşu yeşil yol degenin to'g'risida bormi deb so'radi. Mana men mayli birisini ko'rsatdim. Bu Qashqarda yoki Urumchida bo'lishi kerak. Mana mushundaq bir yo'l alayda maxsus odamlar ishki a'zolarini to'shiydigan alayda bir yo'lni baqilgan. Buningda bu yerda ko'p vaqtlarda Uyg'urcha yoki Arabcha yoki bo'lmasa Xanzucha yozilgan xatlar bor. Manada inglizcha bor ekan.
They say in Chinese as well, in Chinese characters. So this is a fairly quick drive. And
bu nayta tiz bağını bulduğun bir yol, yani airportga. Turma aşu doktorxanaga bağlıq şunun içinde yoki bo'lsa biz Falun Gonglarninki ichki a'zolarini olgan tadqiqotimizni qargan vaqtidagi mushundaq o'rinlashtirishlarga selishtirib va tadqiq qilib baqsaq bo'ladi.
But I will say there are provinces that are adjacent to East Turkestan.
Bu Sharq Turkiston yoki Shinjongda bo'lib atqanlar.
As I acknowledged back in June, similar all-inclusive clusters like the one I've just shown you, like this in our
6-cı ayda düşendigimge seliştoğa vaqtida
So at the risk of going too far into the Aksu weeds, I interviewed two witnesses in Turkey and I believe their testimony is germane.
Kamplar to'g'risidagi ham mushu jasad ko'ydirishlar to'g'risida men Turkiyaga borib ikki Uyg'ur bilan suhbatlashdim. Buning ichidagi birchi 99-yildan 2004-yilgacha turmada yotgan bir kishi ekan. Men bilan suhbatda bo'ldim.
A 5-minute drive from the current Aksu compound, just a little bit inland from the river.
O vaqtdagi turmuning o'rnimi taxminiy mishadan 3-4 kilometrga kelgan bir o'rin ekanligini dedi. Bu Aksu doktorxonasimi SARS kasallik bilan bo'lgan doktorlarni davolash qilingan. Hem bu turmusiga, bu yüzü yatqan turmuga bölgünçe yoki dinni aşqın Uyghur jinoyatchilarni so'laydigan turma ham shularningki doktorxonasi ki hozir bu doktorxona shu qayta tarbiyalash o'rinlaridagi jinoyatchilarni bartaraf qiladigan salomatlik qaradigan bir doktorxona ekan. Hamda bu doktorxona bilan mushu jasad ko'ydirish o'rnini bu men ziyorat qilgan kishi tunib berdi. Hem şu yerda müşahideki pırak çıkıdığan pırak muş orundan süngekning pıraqı çıkıdığanlığı bularni aslida bular asli o'ylaydikan bu yerga ehtimol Xanzularninki jasadi bo'lishi mumkin deb o'ylaydikan, chunki Uyg'urlar o'ligini ko'ydirmaydi, Xitoylar o'ligini ko'ydirdi, shunlashqa shuna deb o'ylaydikan bu aslida. Yana bir tadqiq ziyoratimdagi odam u bir qancha qatim shuning oldidan mashina deb o'tgan vaqtida u yoqdan kelgan g'ayri bir xil puroqlarninki nimalarni aytgan chiqadiganligini. Biz hozir bu yerda bir chiqayotgan tutunninki nimasini ko'rmasak-mi? Chunki tutunning chiqmasligiga sabab bu yoqda suv bilan ko'ydirilgandan keyin suv bilan bir taraf qilish texnikasi qo'llanilgan bo'lgan bo'lishi mumkin. Bu gaz bilan ko'ydirilgan, qanday ko'ydirilgan bo'lsa, uni bir taraf qilish uskunalari bo'lgan bo'lishi mumkin. Shunlashib qo'yilmaganda bu ko'ydirish, jasad ko'ydirish көйдіріш азырқы техникасында бұрынғы селештоғанда 8 қетім тез болды екен. Мен азыр bir yerde nima uchun bundaq tizlashtirganlik to'g'risida to'liq isbot ko'rsatib berolmayman, nima uchun bo'lganligi haqida. Ammo nima maqsadda mushundaq tiz ko'ydirish texnikasini qo'llanganligi, qanchalik odam ko'ydirilganligi to'g'risida men tafsil uchun beraman. Ammo men bunga nihoyat qiziqqan bir masala, nima uchun mushundaq bo'lganligini sizlarga qanday uqmayman, ammo men uchun nihoyat muhim bir masala. Yana bir tarafdan men o'zim tushuntirsam yoki men mumkin qadar so'rash to'g'ri keladi. Ki Uyghur ayollarını kısırlaştırış hem ondan keyinki bu planlıq toğut haqqıları toğrusunda ondan Uyghur adamlarının ki bu işki əzalarını başqalarına 500.000 pound iqtisadi bir income yoki payda kelib beradi. Meniki so'raydigan bir savolim bundan keyin bir ichki a'zolarni bir taraf qilish haqidagi bir nimani ko'rsatmoqchi PDF
and they're turning a local profit at the same time.
Bu yerlik milletni yo'qotish, Beijingning yo'qotish siyosatiga foydasi bo'lishdan sart, ya'ni yerlik hukumatningki pul tepish uchun bu nihoyat muhim bir manba. Uyg'urlarningki ichki a'zolarini mesela öləvatqan yoki bütün Uyğurlarningki 5%'ninki ichki a'zolarini aldı deyilsek, bu nihoyat bir addi bo'ldi, chunki o'ng'ay bo'ldi, chunki bu Tibetlarningki nima Falun Gong murtlarning o'rniga hozir Uyg'ur va Qozoqqa o'xshash xalqlar o'rnini egalladi. Ham shularningki ichki a'zolarini setish, elish qatorliqlar bo'lib kelyotdi. Bu
this is where the original question may have led and what it may have been driving at. The fact is there is a massive contradiction.
Bu yerda amaliyotda bu yerda Jungo Kommunistik Partiyasininki mushu ichki a'zolarni majburiy elish siyosati ham vaqaligi bo'lyotdi. Bu vaqaliklarning hammasi Xitoydagi turmalar yoki mushtaq tarbiyalash kurslarida bo'lyotdi. Men buni doim o'tirib qo'yib kirayotaman. Meningki Xitoy haqidagi tadqiqotim, u men Xitoy tadqiqoti bo'yicha men kasbiy tadqiqotchi emas. Ammo men uzun yillar burun Xitoy tadqiqotchilari bilan nihoyat ko'p suhbatlarda bo'lgan. Xitoyningki iqtisodiy manbalari yoki bu ishlarni qildiganlarning asosi hukumatningki bevosita iqtisodiy yardım, iqtisodiy maoshini oladi. Ammo eng muhimi shu Jungo meditsina sohasida salomat ham kuchli to'g'ri bo'lgan ichki a'zolarni tayyorlagan bo'lishi oldingi shart. Hozir shunlashqa bu doktorlarning qildigan ishi to'g'ri sağlam bo'lgan ichki a'zolarni chet ellik mushundaq ichki a'zolarni kerak qiladigan bemorlarga tayyor qila oladigan bo'lish bir sharoitni shakllantirish kerak. Xitoy mushundaq bir sahaning ichida o'zininki o'rnininki nihoyat yuqori bo'lishini hozir dunyoga jakkalagandek bir holatda. Men dunyodagi masalan Vatikan va boshqalarga o'xshash munosabatlik o'rinlarningki bu to'g'risida ifoda bildirishni umid qilganligi. Men ezelden Beijing'e işençem batı. Bu hata yolunu Beijing çokum kilercil oңuşluş mümkün, yani bir qetim oңuşluş mümkün dep ümit qılattım. Ama undaq bo'lmadi. Hem bunu bazı g'arbdagi Xitoy qo'llovchilari yoki Xitoy o'zlarininki qilayotgan mushularning ishininki to'g'riligi, to'g'ri yo'lda bo'layotganligini qildi. 2016 yildan boshlab 12 yoshdan boshlab Uyg'urlarninki bütün Uyg'urlarning, ya'ni 12 yoshdan yuqorilarninki qon tarkibini tekshirish va yuqori tekshirishlarni yapadi. Hem mushu vaqtlarda o'zi xohlab o'zininki ichki a'zolarini berdiganlarning soni dramatikli bektiz yuqori bo'ldi. Bu biraligi anormalchilik. Ammo mushu bo'layotgan ishlarning hammasini g'arbdagi Xitoy qo'llovchilari meni doim besib keldi. Ammo men har doim bu masalani oldiga ittirib kelyapman. Qandaqla bo'lmasin, meningki demoqchi o'g'lim buni qonunliq ham to'g'ri bir yo'l bilan bir tushuntirilish kerakligini hem yazık arqılıq talep qılıman. Yani bu tədqiqatçılarning hammasi müşahede məslenge meningki tədqiqatım boyunca bazılarını mening intervyu qilgan adamlarım müşahede var. Nurgun misallarını men ko'rsatib bera olaman. Bu yıl, bir yıl içinde Xitoy 50 ming ichki a'zoni almashtirib bera oladiganligini e'lon qildi. Ham bularning hammasi o'z ixtiyorligi bilan o'zining ichki a'zolarini so'qqigichilar deb e'lon qildi. Bugun bularninki mushunda xiyolini amalga oshirish uchun to'g'ri qulaylik sharoit yaratadigan bu qayta tarbiyalash kamplari va turmalarda yetayotgan Uyg'urlar buningki asos manbasi bo'ladi.
And a Chinese vaccine that barely clears the 50% effectiveness mark. So given the Chinese Communist Party's somewhat
Jungo Kommunistlik partiyasiga ba'zilar mushundaq bir yo'lni tayyor qilib berayotgan, to'g'ri qilayotganligini deydigan lamiba ham bularga mening har doim so'raydigan savollarim bor. Masalanga Aqsuda men bergan mushu misollar undaq bir o'ng'ay bir besib yushiruvag'ini bo'ldigan masala emas. Rahmat sizlarga, hammanglarga ko'p rahmat aytaman. Meningki savolim bor. Albatta, meningdan boshqalarning taqdimi ko'p savollar bo'lishi mumkin.
Before Professor Lynch asks you questions, you may have omitted something, unless my memory is wrong, about the age range of disappeared persons.
Mumkin bir narsani qo'shib qo'yish mumkinchiliging bormi? Masalan, qaysi yoshdagilar hammadan tez yo'qolib ketyapti bu odamlar? 18-28 arası dedimi?
That is a number that comes from the World Organization to investigate the
bu qayadan olgan uchurlar, bu uchurlar dunyodagi har qaysi tadqiqot markazlariniki falangungchilarnikilarni va boshqa guruhlardagi odamlarni tadqiqot orqali o'ttirga chiqqan sonliq ma'lumot va ular bilan ko'p birga tadqiqot bo'lganligim uchun mening olgan o'rnim shu. 28-29 yoshdagilar ko'proq yo'qolib ketar ekan.
Thank you very much for coming.
Sizning kelganingiz uchun ko'p rahmat.
Just on exploring the idea of the hungry beast. You say that there are 60,000
siz mushundaq navbatda cho'ng bir talab ostida 60 mingdan oshiq ichki a'zolarninki bu har yiliga almashtirilganligini dedingiz. Bu buning ichida taxminan 20dagi o'zi xohlab o'zininki organlarini iyon qiluvchilar bu butun Angliyadagi xohlab o'zininki organlarını berdiganlarning nechasiga barobar.
And so that to my mind, raises the
Şundaq
issue
boldu eken,
of
menin kallamıma
why
kelgen bir
there
mesele.
then aren't enough donors from the sources that are used in the West, and what the sources of donors are outside of Xinjiang. And I ask, is there a live donor program in China?
Xitayda hayat adamninki özü hayat durup yoki hayat adam özünün içki a'zalarini berdigan ahvollar bormi? Yo'q, undaq hayat adam men hayat bo'lsammi bermen deydigan ahvol bo'lmaydi.
The problem here is twofold. First of all, there's a disagreement that I should flag between me and some of my colleagues.
Aldılan deydiğim men ve mening tadqiqotchi xizmatdoshlarim bilan bo'lgan fikr o'xshamaslik masalaları mening deydiğim bu bir sen nemishqa bu jasad ko'ydirish o'rnini undaq deb o'ylaysan, chunki bu tarbiya bu ko'ydirish o'rni ehtimol Xitoylarning ko'ydirilgan bo'lishi mumkin. Xitoylar chunki o'zininki nemisini ko'ydirdi. Albatta men bu to'g'risida taqdimni ko'p sizlarga uchirib bermayman, chunki bu meningki o'zimninki tushancam ham meningki gumonim bu mishada, chunki bu shu ichki a'zolarni deymiz yig'ish degan bu nihoyatda sat ism, ammo bu nihoyatda cho'ng bir iqtisodiy kirim yaratadigan bir manbami ham hisoblandi. Albatta odamlarningki bu yerda hech qanday agar ular tuqqanlar ulab o'zaro tuqqanlar ichida masalanga börek masalasi desak bir oilalik odamlarning ichida bir tuqqanlar o'zininki bu nemisini bir börikini bersa bo'ladi deb tushunamiz, ammo hech qanday bir odam o'zininki jigirini bermaydi, chunki jigar bir bo'lganligi uchun bu mumkinchilik yo'q. Masalan, bu börek kerak bo'lgan odamlar Xitoyga berib uni izlab yurmaydi, chunki boshqa yerlarda ular tepish mumkinchiligi bor. Shunlashqa chet eldan Xitoyga berib shu ichki organlarni almashtirayotganlar asosan degidek bu börekni emas, boshqa ichki a'zolar uchun bordi.
Showcase the fact that they've become very good at lung transplants.
And can I ask,
yana bir savol so'rsam, Xitoyda odam o'ldi deyli, bu o'lik kimga taalluq bo'ladi? Hukumat bu o'likka egimi yoki tuqqanlarmi, o'sha oilasimi? Demoqchi o'g'lim agarda hukumat bu yo'shirish yo'shiranmaslikqa o'xshaydigan bir masalani bir taraf qila oladigan
I've lost track of them. The problem on that is that when Jacob Levy, the Israeli doctor, and
bir israeliyalik bir qancha doktorlarningki statistik tadqiqotlarga qilganda men ismini daim unutib qolyapman yana birisininki,
but they looked at this very carefully, and
ularningki
they found that the numbers
tadqiqotlardan
created a perfect
ko'ra
parabolic curve. In other words, the voluntary donation numbers did not
o'z
diverge from,
ixtiyorligi bilan
literally it was based on a
berdigan
very simple
o'zininki
equation.
ichki a'zolarni berdigan
So the voluntary donation
xohlab
numbers are made up. The chances of that
berguvchilarningki
happening
soni
are
nihoyatda
getting
bek tiz yuqoriga o'sib ketgan.
We don't know what the real numbers are.
Ammo bu hukumatningki bergan o'z ichki bedellarini iyon qilishga qo'shildi degan bu nomerlarmi millionmi yoki qanchalik vaqtmi buni uqmaymiz. Chunki bu hukumat bizga demaydi. Mening so'raydigan narsam hukumatning doim sizga beradigan bir garantiyasi bor. Ular deydiki 2 hafta ichida sen nima desang shuni teparalayman. Bu qandaq masala? Qandaqsiga 2 hafta ichida bu ichki a'zoni sana tayyor qilib berish mumkinchilik bo'lgan bo'ldi. Bundaq mumkinchilik qat'iy bo'lmaydi. Chunki buning uchun alohida bir o'rlashtirish bo'lish kerak.
Whereas tissue typing is very important for kidney transplants, you don't actually need it for liver and lung, which is what you say is the major.
Мәсәлән, жүгә кирәк булмайды.
Yes, but we do know that they've done it several times with these emergency
Бөрек
liver
өчен
and even
жүнгүк
kidney
бармайдыдан,
transplant,
әмма
so
бу
4-hour,
өпкә яки
because
җигә
we
дигәндәк
know 3
нимәләрнеке
hospitals
мәсьәләсе
that were
хакында
doing
төшендеришпәгән булсаң,
Now, they
чөнки
stopped
мушындак
reporting on it
өпкә
when
җөрәкләрне,
it followed
өпкә
long
бу
sources
җигәләрне
to
алмаштырылганга
publicize
3
it.
җик
They do.
докторхана бар
The
Хытайда,
hospitals
булар
went to
бурында
Beijing
фалынгунчыларныкины кылатты,
They
ашындагы
always do, but
алмаштырышка
I believe you still have to have some sort of tissue
алмаштырады.
matching in place, and or you get run into problems. Now, the second thing is that they are pretty much guaranteeing live organ harvesting, and again, I'm not
Әң мөһим
as
мәсьәлә
close
бу
to the
yerdə
coalface as I'd
була,
like to be
яки
on this,
хөкүмәт,
but,
яки шу докторлар
I did talk to Matt
siz
recently
әр
about
даим үзенең чукым шу
the paper they're
сезнең
banning,
тәлпиңизне
I think
кандыра
it's
алайдыганлыгы
available
тогрысыдагы ифадалары.
pretty much proves that it's all live organ harvesting, and that's why they're getting the success rate they are.
Шуңлашка мушындак сезгә вакыт тарафта һәм уныңки сүпәт җәһәте бирәлегән капалыты уларга найт көп адамларныңки ишенче герешәлегән.
You do talk about in 1994
94 елда бәгән бер учурыңда 94 жылдагы адамны ат этиш буйрыкка чыгарылган адамны өлүм жазасына хөкүм кылынган адамны өлмәйдиган иягә бер ок этиш өлтүрүш ним кылынган. Бу мәсьәләне муша Әнвәр Тохта арымызда бар, шу төшәндә өстә хәдим яхшы төшәгәнлеген булатты. Уның дейишчә окны атка вакытында шу вакытла өлмәйдиган yerге этилганлыгы, әмма бу ашу içki əzalarını evlişqa bir vaqtninki yetidiganligi, vaqt yetişidigan bir şarait yaratadiganligini atqa vaqtidimi? Chunki bundaq vaqtida içki əzalarını kesib elish uchun kesgan vaqtida odam tax his qila oladi kesganliknimi, to'liq o'lmaganligi uchun. Normalda mesela bir toşqanni ötdəgən vaxtda adam toşqanmı özünü qarşılıq göstərdi bundaq əhval astida. Adam sezildi, amma qarşılıq göstərməydigan bir xil halətdə etildi. Əlbəttə bunu biz nəhayət aniq bilməyimiz, amma bu aşı biz aniq berələydigan, hazırғы sizlərə berələydigan aniq bir ispatlıq bir məsələ. Ondan başqa bir bu məsələ haqqında bir Uyghur saqçımı bu to'g'risida isbot bergan. Ondan başqa bunun qatnashgan doktor Anvar doktor aramızda. Anvarninki bergan uchurlarga qaragan vaqtida bu odam qarshilik qilgudek mumkinchilik bo'lmagan holatda anandan keyin buningki etish buyrug'i ijro qilinganligi mush jarayonda uning ichki a'zolarining elib olinganligi haqida isbot bergan. Men yana bir masalani demoqchi, ya'ni sening bergan uchurlaringga asosan sen
you give or you cite large blood volume tests.
Nəhayət çoğ həcmdəki adamlar, yəni köp adamlarınki qan tərkibinin təşkilləşdirildiyi toğrusunda bir isbat aytıb ötdüm.
When you say large volume,
sen nəhayət köp sandakı deməkçi oğununda qaysı nömrə üçün dep biləsən mi?
And we think that's gone away.
Men sanninki jiqliqini emas, mishal bo'layotgan masala haqida demoqchiman.
2001, the industry was still in its infancy in China, and so maybe they had all kinds of uses.
The reason I asked was someone was suggesting yesterday that there's
Benim soruşumdaki sebeplerinin birisi tünügün müşnanga münasebetlik bir kan tekşürüş hakkında uçurlar verilgen. Men şunlaşqa men mişaqta mesela aşı elingan kanninki azcık meselesi. Çünkü bunu men aniq dep bermeymen. Çünkü onunki meninki tədqiqatım bilan jiq münasebeti yo'q. Uni qanchalik qan ağallıqlarını men onu dep bermeymen. Albatta bundaq yo'lbos o'rindiqi va boshqa bir xil jazolash nimalar to'g'risida Tibetliklar, Uyg'urlarni aytib ko'p bu masalalarda nechilning denyapti, ammo bu tarafda bek jiq nim qilinmayman, uchur bermayman sana. Ko'p rahmat.
So, could I just follow up? You said
Men bay sen bir mesele üstüne toxtaldın. Adamlarninki kan tekşürülüşüyle hakkında aytib ötdün. Muşu biz burun anlağanlarımız ve seninki tədqiqatından görə muşu kan tərkiblərini nima üçün alğan buluş mümkün ki qandaq bir tizimliklər buludu.
I was a skeptic about organ harvesting. I was very interested in the Falun Gong issue initially.
Men bu içki əzalarını içki əzalar məsələsində mən Falun Gongçulardan başlagan, həm menimki bununla qızıqışım başlaşırdı ki, məsələlərin dəstək vaxtlarında
did not know anything about this issue at all.
Bundaq məsələlərin heç qandaq məlumatım yoxdu.
And she described
bu məsələni bilməydiğən bir ayalla söhbətləşkənlik ki, bu ayalının ki özününki kan təşürtüş və kan bəgən degəndək kan tərkibləri, yəni PKG degen oxşaş, yəni tizimlaydiganlıqları. Andan başqa birisi 10 minut faqat şu közünü lam tekşürüş ep bağallığı, köz tekşürüş ep bağallığı dedi. Onun faqat közünün içki, közünün alımı işini göstərkən, amma onunki qanchalik jirahni ko'ralaydigan, ko'ranmaydiganliklari emas, ko'zningki ko'rish ko'rmaslik salomatligini emas, ammo boshqa shu ko'z orqali ichki a'zolarning salomat emasligini tekshirgan bundaqda deydi. Chunki buning ichida 50,000 ichki a'zolar to'g'risidagi ichki a'zolarningki basisida to'xtalsaqmi, bu nihoyatda yuqori hajmdagi bir iqtisodiy kirim bo'lib hisoblanadi. Masalan, gap aytsak,
both Sarayagul and Tursunai.
Sarayagul ve Tursunai, yani iki guvaçı, müşaktaki her ikili ise bularninki adamların salametligini tekşürüş deganning ichida albatta qon tekşürüş ve başka tekşürüşler var. Bularninki birinci qetim tekşürüşten keyin ikkinchi qetim bir qog'oz keldi. O qog'ozlarda adamlar şu tekşürülgen adamlarning ichida bir qancha adamninki bunda check mark degan bir belgi qo'yilganligi, anadan keyin bu adamlarninki 3-4 kunlardan keyin yo'qolib ketirganligi haqida ispat berdi. Bu o'xshamagan kamplardan berilgan ispat, birisi boshqa yerda, yana birisi boshqa yerda turib shunday o'xshash hadislar yuz bergan. Yana bir narsa, ba'zilarga qo'liga bir xil bilezikka o'xshash bir narsa qo'yib qo'ydi ekan, sep qo'ydi ekan. Ularninki yeshini surat qilib boqsam, bularning yoshlari 28-29 yoshlar bo'lsa, bular ba'zi kunlari shu yarim kechalarni yo'qolib ketadi. Baya siz aytgandinki, shu kan tekşürüş meselesini yapaysak, insan haklarının tədqiqatlarının bəzi uçurlardan görə
cheek swabs to get DNA.
Yəni DNA nimələrin eliş, hem bu DNA eliş nazaret uçurlarım degenge mən ancaq qoşulub ketməyəm. Bunun başqa səbəblərim var. DNA cross matching degan ikki odamga bek moslashmaydiganligi to'g'risida Kaliforniyadagi bir ayol tunigun aytdi, kesbiy javob berdi. Masalan, men ishlamaymanki, bu shundaq narsa. Biz Falun Gongchilarninkidan misol qilib qilsak, ya'ni men bekor ko'p ishlaganim 2013 yildan keyin Falun Gong a'zolari oz bo'ldi yoki yo'q bo'ldi. Uningdan keyingi vaqtlarda shularninkini yana o'xshash, yani ko'zini tekshirish ham qon tekshirishni olib borgan. Bu yana o'xshashlar bu yerda yuz beryapti. Shunglashqa meningki gumonim shu Xitoylarning o'xshash ishni qilayotganligi, yana birisi Xitoy hukumatiningki bu organlarni almashtirishga vaqtini tezlashtirganligi masalalari mening gumonimni paydo qiladi. Nurg'unlagan Uyg'urlar bizga bergan guvohliklarda o'zi bilmaydigan bir dokumentlarga qo'l qo'ydirishga talab qo'l qo'ydirilganligini aytib o'tyapti. Sence bu qog'ozlar mumkin o'lgan odamlarningki nimasini jasadlarini qaytarib bermaydigan uchun yozilgan narsami? Sen qanday qaraysan? Men uni uqmayman albatta. U nimaga qo'l qo'yganligi menga ma'lum, men uni bilmayman. Chunki men desammi, baribir ikkinchi qo'l erishgan uchurlarim deyman, men buni degim yo'q bu yerda hozir. Xitoylar shunday organlarni elish masalalarida 2008-2012 o'limga hukm qilingan jinoyatchilarning og'anligi to'g'rilari tadqiqotlarida bo'lgan 2014-2015 yillarga vaqtida
we're not going to use, they said to the West, we're not going to use prisoner organs anymore.
Chetliklarga biz ichki deymiz jinoyatchilarningki ichki a'zolarini ishlatmaymiz deganda chet el medialarga e'lon qildi, ammo Xitoy nimalarda medialarda bo'lsa jinoyatchilarmi o'zi xohlab o'zining ichki a'zolarini berganligi to'g'risida chiqqanligi to'g'risida xabarlar berilgan. Bu Falun Gonglar üstü yüz bergan bo'lsa, hozir Uyg'urlarninkida bo'lishi ehtimollik nihoyat yuqori bo'pmi? Bugungi kunda mushu kamp va turmalarda nihoyat ko'p Uyg'urlarninki solinishi men ishonaman, chunki bularning ba'zilari ehtimol jinoyatchi, yarmini jinoyatchi desak, yarmi jinoyatchi bo'lmasligi mumkin. Bununla bir qonunluq bir nima ko'rsatilish kerak, ya'ni material shunglashqa bu ispat ko'rsatish masalan bu turmadagi jinoyatchi yoki bu kishilar o'zi bilmaydigan tushunmaydi buni yozgan xatning nimaligini tushunmasimi garchi qog'ozga ekilib bunga qo'l qo'yilgan bo'lishi mumkin chunki agar shunday so'roq savollar bo'lgan vaqtida o'sha jinoyatchiniki o'zi xohlab berganligi to'g'risidagi bu isbotlarni ko'rsatishi mumkin. Albatta bir Uyg'urdan so'rab sen o'zing ishga a'zolarini shunday beramsan desa u yoqda ish tabiiy. Men eng oxirgi bir savolimni so'rab olay.
Could there be another alternative explanation that they're doing research on and collecting a data bank for DNA?
Biz mumkin qadar shu Xitoylarning qilgan DNA databasini elish mumkinchilik bor. Albatta bor bu to'g'risida mumkinchilik qildi. Men bir qancha 3 doktorlar ko'rishib baqdim. Ular 99-yildan boshlab bu masalada Sharq Turkistonda nihoyat chuqur tadqiqotlar yapganligi bo'pmi 99-yildan boshlab Uyg'urlarningki qon tarkibini tekshirishninki doimlik bo'lganligini aytdi. Men nima bunday qildi deb so'ragan savolimga bu birlikda biologik qurol yarog' ishlab chiqarish mumkinchilik bo'lgan bo'lishi mumkin dedi. Ham genetik yo'qchi xarakterli qurol yaroqlar ishlaydiganga albatta men buning hech qanday isbotim yo'q, ham men shunday deb qaramayman. Bu narsa bir narsa deb beramayman men sana.
And I know Mr. Sabi had a question.
Mr. Sabininki bir savoli va undan keyin boshqa so'raydi. Men bir narsani nihoyat qo'rqinchli bir narsani deb qo'ymoqchi, men qo'rqayotgan bu yoqdagi men ko'rgan yeshil yo'l, ya'ni alayda chiqib ketish yo'li airportdagi meni bek vahimga solayotdi. Yani birisi 24 minut ichida shu airportga berish Arlıqның 24 minut bo'lishi degan mushularning hammasini sen o'zaro nim qilib nag aeroplanlarning nag
Aksu Airport mainly goes to you would have if you want to take something to
Aksu Airport'dan mumkin bevosita Saudiya Arabiyaga berish mumkinchiligi borligi
It is an international
Urumchiga orqali Ürümçiden Saudiya Arabiyaga qancha vaqtda berish mumkinchiligi va 5-6 soat ichida berish mumkinchilikni yaratalaydi. 20 soatlik mumkinchilik bor, yana o'xshamaydi. Qanday o'rlashtirishdan bog'liq. So'raydigan savolingizni so'ragan bo'lsangiz, Mr. Sabi.
No, sir, we are running out of time. We are already 20 minutes late, so rather break for 15 minutes and come back. Thank you very much.
Sizga nihoyat ko'p rahmat. Savolimizni shunchalik. Hozir 15 minut demoqchi. Har qanday savolinglar bo'lsa, Mr. Gonmanga yezib bertinglar, yeziq orqali javob bersin. 15 minut demelish.
Assalamu alaikum. İkra aldık şart Türkistanlık aziz kırındaşlar. Hemenlarning bu vaqti. Xeyirli olsun. Men Parat Yurunqaş. Hemenlarni Londondan yürekten salamlayman. Ko'rayotganlar Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi tor televiziyasining naqmadan programmasi. Hozir biz sizlarga bu xalqaro Uyg'ur sot kollegiyesining ikkinchi qétimliq soti o'tkazilayotgan Londondagi Churchill House sarayidan naqmadan programmani taqdim qilyapmiz aziz qarindoshlar. Bu yerda oldi bilan sizlardan bir qisqacha bir uzr so'raydi. Uzr so'rab boshlaydi gapimizni. Chunki ba'zi texnik sabablar tufaylidan ba'zi jiddiy boshqa sabablar tufaylidan bugun programmamizni naqmadan programmamizni vaqtida boshlayamiz. Bu sababdan ekran oldidagi bütün aziz ko'rmanlarimizdan uzr so'raymiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, dastlabdan biz degan to'q boshlagan vaqtida biz sotninki simliq internet nimasi orqali emas, bu naq maydon programmasida simliq bağlantı orqali emas, ulanma orqali emas, naq maydondan bevosita taqdivatimiz shu zalda turib, uning uchun bexatarlik nuqtasidan her kuni biz internet bağlantısiningki maxfiy nomerini her kuni shunday qilib baxtiyor apandim, her kuni ilishga, udulliq ilishga to'g'ri keldi. Shuning uchun bugun atiganda bu internet bağlantısini ulash jarayonidan biroz masala chiqib, vaqtida programmamizni boshlayamiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, bugun mana xalqaro Uyg'ur sot kollegiyesining ikkinchi qétimliq soti bu Xitoyning shuncha qattiq to'salg'ulari, besimlariga, ta'ditlariga qaramasdan muvaffaqiyat boshlangan va bugun oxirgi kuniga qadam qo'ydi. Oxirgi kuni qadam qo'ydi aziz qarindoshlar. Bu qétimliq sotda hozirgacha mana jami Sharq Turkistonlik lager shohidi, guvohchilar, tadqiqotchilar bo'lib, Sharq Turkiston 12 Sharq Turkistonlik qarindishimiz bu yerda shunday qilib baxtiyor apandim. Guvohlik berdi. Bularning ichida 3 nafar lager şahidi var, 3 nefer lager şahidi var ve 4 nefer başka şahidimiz. Onundaki 5 nefer bir yerde tədqiqatçı süptide guvalık verdi aziz qarindoshlar. Bugün bütünley 9 nefer çetellik mutaxassis, yuqori dereceli çetellik mutaxassislar, qonunshunoslar bugün guvalık berishga başladı ve başlaydı. Çünkü asasda bu sot özünün hükümüne çıkırış baskıya qarab ketyapti. Aziz qarindoshlar, shu sotninki qisqa damlash fursatidan foydalanib oldi bilan sizlardan bir uzr so'raylik. Sizlarga bir salom beraylik. Uningdagi mush fursatdan foydalanib turib bir qisqa bir suhbat o'tkazmoqchi. Aziz qarindoshlar, bu yenimda o'tirgan xonimni tunogimga suhbat o'tkazgan Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyining program yetakchisi Zumrat Ay Erkin xonim Germaniyadan Ataydan shu sotning xizmatlari, qurultayning xizmatlari yordamlash uchun Ataydan keldi. Efendim, bu efendimle köpünçanlar Tunis'le bizdeki özünün şu Uyghur davası atıgan, Şarkı Türkistan Milli Müstakillik davası atıgan bizden Kanadalık Peter Even efendim özü burumu Dünya Uyg'ur qurultiyi 7-8 yıl nait fedakarlıkla hizmet kılgan ve keyin Amerika'ga yötkeldi. Amerika'ga yötkeldiğinde kim o? Yana Amerika'daki bu Ömer Kanat efendim riyasetçilik kıvatkan Uyghur kişilik hukuk kuruluşunda üyedim. Yani program yetekçisi ve tadqiqotchi sifatida bu davaga aktiv xizmat qilib kelyapti ve Ataydan bu ikkinchi qétimliq sotga Uyg'ur kişilik hukuk qurilishi vakolatidan guvohlik berish maqsadida olay taklif qilindi. Bugun Xudoyim bo'lsa Peter Even efendim bu sotga guvohlik berdi. Xo'sh, men oldi bilan Peter Even efendimdan xush keldingiz deyman. Savolimni tarjima qilib bersangiz bo'ldi. Endi bu Peter Even efendimni ko'pincha qarindoshlarimiz Tunji qurultayining faoliyatini kuzatayotgan. Masalan, Peter Even efendim o'zim uzun yilni yaqin Uyg'ur masalasida xizmat qilyapti demdi. Oldi bilan Sharq Turkiston xalqi vakolatidan rahmat aytaman. Shu Peter Even efendim shu bir chet-ellik Uyg'ur harakati uchun xizmat qilayotgan bir chet-ellik bo'lish sifati bilan shu Uyg'ur sotiga qanday baho berdi o'zi, buning ahamiyatiga qanday qaraydi?
What do you think it can really bring to the community, but also outside of the community?
Yeah, thanks for having me first. Yeah, I think working for the Uyghur community for so long, I think it's good in some ways. Everything in my professional career, working on the Uyghur issues, in some ways led up to the Uyghur Tribunal. It's become a necessary platform by which we identify some of the crimes that China's committing, bring together different kinds of experts and witnesses who can evaluate what's actually happening in the region and what's happening over the past 6 or 7 years since I began at the World Uyghur Congress. So that's what I think you can share.
Ben neçinliği sayabilgendek 6-7 yıllığı müşüşünü ketiyatımın hem Uyghur emes sütünde müşü sotun kurulganlığa memnun hoş buldum hem bir xil tabiiy müştaq müşekip kaldı. Çünkü bu neçinliği qırğınçılıq mağır buldu. Şuna hazırki vaziyette müşü sotun kurulganının bir xil tabiiy şekilde kuruldu.
I think to the question, to the point about what is sort of the meaning, what's the purpose, and what we can do with the tribunal, I think the findings, however they come out, whether crimes against humanity or genocide, I think they can be used as a platform or a foundation for further advocacy. I think in and of themselves, maybe they're not going to solve the problem. Of course, not one thing will do that, but I think we can then use the information and use the judgment and use our association with the testifiers and use the information to then continue our advocacy, which we've done for so many years.
Bu sotun əhmiyyəti xeyli çox dəb bilmən, çünki bu sotun keyin məsələn nəticəsi biz deyəndək Xitay hökumətini tənqidləb qılamızsaqmı, lakin bunun nəticəsi şunda mühim oldu, çünki doklad çıxandan keyin, bir report çıxandan keyin bunu hər qandaq adam, hər qandaq təşkilat işlətələydi, çünki bu nəticənin bətlik bir mühim bir doklad olub işləndi. Andan keyin bunu biz özümüzdən işimizə vəziyyətimiz üçün Uyğurlar işləsi buldu, həm Uyğurlardan sırt işlətkil buldu, çünki məsələn parlament əzalarına verib müştəqillik söz etsək buldu, həm hər qandaq şəkildə bunu özümüz pozitiv bir işlə qıla alayımız.
Bir qanun əsas qıla alaydı deməkçi. Məsələn, Petriev'in efendim bu mesela şu sot avval qétimliq sottum şunda bolğan Xitay hökumətinin sot başında işdim bu nəhayət iğir sot qaqıb dünya qurultayı sotu qoğalı qılğan bütün adamlar nəhayət iğir hücum qıldı. Bu qétimliq sottum şunda iğir dərəcədə hücum qılıb hətta tədis silvatdı nəhayət mafiya bir şəkildə də həm də bugün məsələn nurgun maqallarını elan qılmış sot qarşı həm də Xitayның bu dərəcədə bu sotun bir tərəfdən Xitay deydi biz bu sotunu etiraf qılmayımız deydi. Bir tərəfdən bu dərəcədə sotdan ənsirab ketişinin səbəbi nədir məsələn?
So, as you've seen during the first step in the June hearings, there was a lot of pressure coming from the Chinese government, a lot of intimidation and harassment directed towards the victims, and this is the same this time around as well, especially the witnesses, camp survivors. So the Chinese government, it is ironic that they say that they're always condemning this tribunal, but at the same time they say that it's not worth anything, that they don't really care about this. Why do you think they're acting in such a way?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I think they're threatened by it. They understand that having an official tribunal like this to hear the evidence, they're worried. I think they're worried about the world becoming more aware of what's happening to Uyghurs, and this is why they're speaking out. And you see the propaganda pushes in 2018, 2019 after some details of the camps emerged. Now more details are emerging, so I think they're going to be increasingly aggressive, and I think that's why we're seeing it. I think it actually is a positive sign to say that the Chinese government itself is very worried about what we're doing here over the weekend.
Bu bek iniq, bu Xitay hökuməti özü rəsmi qoqatıdı. Bunun bilan karımız yox degan bilan özləri qoqatıdı, çünki nəçilmə yağı quvvaçılıqlar köpüyüb nim qıldı, andan keyin isbatlar jiq buldu. Şuna hazır bu meydanda isbatlar texmi inçik şəkildə analiz bulub, bütün lager şahitlər bolsun, başqa şahitlərdən nəmisi müş isbatını əkəb berətidir. Şuna bu isbatların aşkarlanışıdan Xitay hökuməti bunun şunçilik qoqatıdı. Həm nəçilmə yağı müş isbatlar çıxqandan yağı özlərinin propaganda şəkildə xəbərlərini berib qoqatıdı. Şuna bular rast gəpnin çıxışığa chiqishidan qo'rqib mushtaq takliflarni qo'ydi.
O'ziniki jinoyatniki bash qilishdan qo'rqib buni qilyapti. Masalan, oxirida so'raydigan savolim shu. Masalan, bugun tushdan keyin eng oxirida sud oxirlashgan oz qolganda Petriev'in efendim guvohlik berdi ekan. Hozir shu bugun berdigan guvohlik haqida qisqacha bir oldin ushur berarlarmi bizga?
So you're testifying this afternoon before Adrian's ends. Can you just tell us briefly what you're presenting?
So very briefly, I conducted research in 2020 and 2021 on the mass detention of Uyghur and other Turkic imams and religious figures. So I'll be looking at the data and presenting it to the tribunal on the one hand, essentially also pairing that with information and research we've done from UHRP on the detention of intellectuals, intellectual figures, prominent members of the community. So I'll try to be essentially showing or arguing that the Chinese government is specifically targeting prominent Uyghur and other Turkic figures as a means of basically severing the intergenerational transmission of religious knowledge, cultural knowledge across generations for Uyghur people and other Turkic people in the region, as a component perhaps of atrocity crimes.
Ben 2020 yıl bilen 2021 yılının aralığında xeyli təşkil nimo research qildim, tədqiqat qildim. Onun şu temisi şu bizning vatandagi Sharqiy Turkistondagi imomlarni Xitoy hukumati solab lagerlarga ketib nemqatganini ham ularga besim qilib, mushlarni target nimlaydi? Muşlar qarıtıb durub, bütün imamlar bulsun, ya bo'lmasa yozuvchilar bulsun, bizning ali
Uyghur sarxillari.
Sarxillarini ham, masalan, mutaxassislarni, ziyolilarni hammasini akirib ketib, yo'qotib, ham shu lagerlarga kirib nemqatganini to'g'riliq so'zlayman, chunki bularning yo'qotishining sababi Uyg'urlarning madaniyatini yo'qotamiz degan bir shaklda shu Xitoy hukumati qirg'inchilikni mush tarafdan elib ketib bordi deb shu to'g'riliq so'zlayman.
Rahmat, hurmatli Petra efendim, guvohligingizga muvaffaqiyat tilayman. Sizga tekrar ko'p rahmat, sizga Zumrat xonim tekrar ko'p rahmat. Rahmat. Thank you. Rahmat. Maqsad qafaringiz inshaalloh. Rahmat. Thank you. Hurmatli televizor ko'ruvchilar, hozir bizningki shu Sharq Turkiston milliy hareket uchun xizmat qilayotgan kanadalik do'stimiz Petra Evin efendimninki qarashlarini oldik. Birozdan keyin guvohlik berdi. Tushdan keyin albatta asosiy o'zimi deb o'tdi. Guvohlik temasi, ya'ni asosiy shu diniy zotlarninki, bo'libmi imomlarninki ziyonkashlik uchrash ahvoli haqida bir chet ellik yerda guvohlik berish oldida turdi. Az qarindoshlar, bu yerda shu nuqtani eskartib qo'ygim keldi. Qayta bugun sud oxirgi kuni bugun London vaqti 3dan keyin soat Xudoyim bursa 6:30larda oxirlashdi va 7da nihoyatda muhim bir faoliyat bor. Az qarindoshlar, birisi shu Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchilik qarorininki Angliya parlamentida qabul qilinishida nihoyat zo'r rol o'ynagan, boshlamchi rolni o'ynagan Nusrat G'ani boshchiligidagi parlament a'zolariga, yana Xitoyning Morgalsiga uchragan parlament a'zolariga Sharq Turkiston xalqi nomidan bir minnatdorlik tashakkur bildirish murosimi o'tkazildi Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi tomonidan. Buni biz London vaqti kech soat 7da, dal 7da boshlandi. London vaqti soat 7da ayrim buni naq maydondan xabar berish qilishimiz. Bu nihoyat muhim bir programma. Buni qochilmanglar aziz qarindoshlar. Andan keyin bu tushdi nihoyat cho'ng suhbatlarimiz bo'ladi. Boshqa allarga bog'lanamiz. O'zimizning Uyg'ur tadqiqotchilar, siyosiy faoliyatchilar bilan telefon orqali bog'lanib ular bilan suhbat olib boramiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, hozir sot kollegiyesining bog'lash hayotlari sotchilar zalga kirishga boshladi. Hurmatli Baxtiyor efendim, sizning qo'shimcha qilgan so'zingiz bormi?
Yo'q, bugun hamda nihoyatda uzun bir kun bo'ldi. Naq maydon taqitishimiz oralig'ida balkim zal yo'tkalganlik sababidan bizlar uzilib qolish mumkin. Lekin Parat efendi degandek, tushdan keyin Yevropa parlamenti a'zolariga berilgan mukofot murosimi, andan keyin sotdagi oyoqlash nutqi Dolqin Aysa efendi so'zlaydigan bu faoliyat 6da tugsa, balkim 7gacha yana bir 6:30da tugaydi sot. 7da biz yana bir faoliyatimizni boshlaymiz. Shuning bugungi balkim soat 8-9largacha bo'lishi mumkin. vaqtni ching tutib naq maydon tarqatishimizga diqqat qilsanlar. Rahmat.
Rahmat Baxtiyor apandim. Hozir kun tartib qaralgan bo'lsak, aziz qarindoshlar, masalan, oldin qatim 6-oyning 4-kuni, 7-kunigacha o'tkazilgan Uyg'ur sot kollegiyesining tunji qétimliq sotiningki eng oxirida Sharq Turkiston xalqiga tunishlik bo'lgan Sharq Turkiston xalqining suyumli qadrli do'sti Adrian Ses, germaniyalik tadqiqotchi Adrian Sesning guvohligi bilan oxirlashgan. Bu qatimki sot şu yana hürmetlik Adrian Ses efendimninki guvalık bilen ahırlaşıda bundan şunu körleşki buldu. Adrian Ses'ninki guvalıkıga sot bağla şehitinin ne kadar ehemmiyet belgelliği körleş mümkün yani kulas karakterlik. Az kardeşler bağla şehiti özünün ordunu ilişki başladı dıktınla sotun devamında bu.
Assalamu alaikum, anglayotgan do'st qarindoshlarim. Mening ismim Rune Steenberg, Uyg'urcha ismim Yusufjon. Men Germaniyada o'tirman, hozir Uyghur Tribunalni tor orqali anglayotman. Men o'zim insonshunos, Uyg'urlarniki urf-odatlarni tadqiqot qilayotgan 10 yildan oshdi mana. Men Uyg'urchani Qashqarda o'rgangandan keyin ba'zi gaplarim balkim Qashqarning shivasida bo'lishi mumkin. Ham ba'zi gaplarmi shu vatandan bo'lgan, masalan, Xitoyni ba'zida Xanzu deyishi mumkin. Sharqiy Turkistonni ba'zida Xinjiang deyishi mumkin. Uningdan so'rayman. Yana Uyg'urcha ana tilim bo'lmagandan keyin meniki ba'zi xatoliklarim chiqib bo'lishi mumkin. Ham ba'zi gaplarni sal oddiroq deyishi mumkin, chunki men maxsusroq shunaqa masroq keladigan gaplarni bilmagandan keyin. Uning ustiga hozir Germaniyada bo'lgandan keyin, to'rda anglayotgandan keyin meniki tarjimanim sal kechroq, sal keyinroq chiqishi mumkin. 5 sekund, 10 sekund keyin chiqishi mumkin, chunki naq maydonda bo'lgan gap YouTube orqali kelsa u musal
Mr. Chairman, our next witness is Laura Hart.
Apologies for necessary absence. Yes.
Yana bir guvohligimiz Laura Hart xonim.
Expert witness is campaign director at Safeguard Defenders, a human rights NGO
Sizlardan kechirim
campaigns for the
so'rayman.
protection of basic human rights and promotes the rule of law in Asia.
Laura Hart bo'lsa,
International law, human rights and international relations.
Kishilik huquq qo'g'daydigan tashkilotning direktori bo'ldi.
Where she was in charge of
Hem aktivist bo'ldi.
on Chinese internal
U burun siyosat hem xalqaro munosabatlarni o'qigan. Burun Jungoninki, Xitoyninki siyosatni tadqiqot qilgan. Uning yozgan
She attempts
doklatdı.
to show the far-reaching and relentless campaigns to silence, intimidate, harass,
Xitaylar
witness
aldı
testimonies,
bilen
either directly or indirectly.
lager yok degen idi. Keyin uni özgürüp lager bolsa terbiyeleş merkezi boldiken
Her organizations have analyzed.
kesbi işlerini ögütüş üçün kılgan lager dep koygan. Şunun özgürüç çoğuluk bir doklat yazgan. Bahanının özgürüşü çoğuluk bir doklat yazgan iken.
Particularly in our last hearing day today. So I'll invite you to make a very brief presentation and then we'll move immediately into questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Hat hanım, bizning vaqtimiz pek jiq bo'lmagandan keyin siz qisqaroq so'zlab beramiz sizningki.
Representing the EU, so just a small rectification for the panel to know. With this, good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to your incredibly important proceedings. As said, I will be testifying on behalf of the panelists who, on the basis of the
men Beijing'de burun işlep bakmagan, hem Avrupa İttifakı üçün işlep bakmagan.
practice of forced televised confessions in China, a practice that has gained considerable momentum since Xi Jinping assumed power. Now, allow me to start by expressing my deepest admiration for the witnesses that have come forward in both sessions of the tribunal's hearings.
Xi Jinping çıkandan keyin Xitayda televizor mecbur guvalıkla köpeyip ketken. Yalgan guvalıkla, mecburi yalgan guvalıkla köpeyip ketken idi.
Following yet another such press conference,
Bu şeyde
the tribunal issued a renewed call to the People's Republic to present their counter evidence. However, while these calls have so far gone unanswered, it is our
Uyghur Tribunal'da bəgin guvalık bəgin guvaçılarga pek hürmet bildirmen. Muşu tribunal bolğandan keyin Xitay hökümetinin bir neçe yığınla bolğan Uyghur Tribunal'a karşı turgan. Lekin ular sözlep atgan geplarning asas yok. Ular degen bahanelermi
and serve the sole purpose of intimidating, discrediting, and silencing independent witnesses overseas. I prepared a short series of slides, which I will go through rather
quickly. Beijing bəgin yalgan ispatlar özümü bir xil cinayet boldu iken. Men şunu bir misalda düşündürüp bereyim.
Since the start of the mass internment campaign, the PRC
Keyin sual sorsanglar boldu.
has changed several times. They went from outright and repeated denial to the admission of existence of voluntary vocational education centers in Xinjiang.
Programdan tutuluş program başlagandan keyin Xitay hökümetininkki şunu to'g'liq so'zlab bergan hikoya bir necha qatim o'zgarib bo'lgan. Aldı bilen lager yok degan idi. Keyin u o'zgarish tarbiyalash markazi bo'ldi degan, lekin 2019-yilda hammaylar maktabdan chiqdi degan edi.
Transnational harassment, long-arm policing, pressure on foreign governments and non-governmental organizations, a campaign that was remarkably efficient in keeping
Ular sirti bo'lgan lagerni ko'rgan guvalıqlarni to'xtatish uchun ularningki guvalıqni to'xtatish uchun bek jiq besim
işletken. Bolupmu chet eldeki Uyghur Kazaklara bolgan besim pek egri bolgan idi. Uningdan başqa Xitay hökümetimi Şərqi Türkistan to'g'liq bek ko'p yolg'on gaplarni qilgan. Ondan shuni to'g'liq so'zlagan, paranglashgan muxbirlar yoki tadqiqotchilar to'g'liqmi ko'p yolg'on gap qilgan edi. Ularning g'aybni ko'p qilgan.
Including the right to privacy and the prohibition of degrading treatment. Next slide, please. The aim of such forced confessions is plural. They're to deny overseas claims by witnesses, such as the one the tribunal has heard, to defend the government policy, to warn possible other witnesses of the consequences either to themselves or to family and loved ones still in China, and ultimately, fourth, and particularly relevant in this case, a practice
Tehdit pek köp bolgan. Sotteki Uyg'urlarga bezlerge tehdit salgan, bezlerge gap qilmasinglar, muqabat bermiz degan idi. Shuning bilan resmiy bo'lgan ishlarni, lagerlarning ishlar sirtqa bildirmaslik uchun bek ko'p kuch qilgan, bek ko'p tirishib bakkan idi Xitoyning hukumati.
On Xinjiang-related issues between January 2020, this is closely following the governor's claims of the camp closure, and August 2021. We have carefully analyzed all of these conferences, and you may move forward with the slides a couple at a time. And the above, the plural aims that I have described are all
2021 ayınki
39 conferences held in Xinjiang. And starting in December
5'den 2021 yılınki 9 aygacha ko'p yig'inlar ochgan edi. Xitoyning hukumati ko'p yig'inlar ochgan edi. Xinjiangda, Şərqi Türkistan'da bo'layotgan ishlar to'g'riliq. Xitoydagilarga ham xalqaradagilarga o'zining hikoyani ma'lum qildirish uchun biz shu yig'inlarning mazmunini tekshirgan ham tadqiqot qilgan. Bu jami 62 yig'inlar bo'lgan. Shu 62 yig'inlardan 19'da Sotteki lager guvachilarninki yaman gaplarni qilgan, ularni axloqsiz yaman odam yaxshi odam emas deb chaqirgan bo'libmi ayollarni bek hujum qilgan. Lagerda yotgan ayollarni bek hujum qilgan edi.
No less than 49 out of the 62 press conferences, with an emphasis on the Beijing ones, contain a variation on forced
television. U bir xil ayollarga hurmatlik qilmaydigan, bo'lmaydigan bir ideologiyadir. Shu ideologiyani ko'rsatdi.
Religious figures, entrepreneurs, relatives, or acquaintances of witnesses abroad.
Shundaq yig'inlarda
their testimonies serve the plural aim of denial, and they're mostly linked to recent outside events, such as sanctions or reports, especially those by Adrian Zenz and Aspi,
yolg'on guvochilar chiqqan.
Frequent victims of slander in these conferences, defending government policy and expressing gratitude, and to a lesser extent, warning. Their statements almost unanimously follow a similar script, basically laid out by the Deputy Director General of the CPC Xinjiang Publicity Department in February 21. They are in fact, if we look at some of them in the next slide,
Aşınak videoların köpüncüsü okşaş oldu. Ula Aspin'i, Adrian Zens'ni tenkit kıldı. Hükümetke minnettarlık bildirdi.
it is also the only outside event which was tackled preemptively with the Beijing conference
Ulanınki köpüncüsü
with no less than 14 overseas witnesses targeted by character assassination both by officials and video testimonies by family or acquaintances.
sözleri, gepleri okşaş boldiken.
The very same Deputy Director
Şunun içinde
General Publicity Department stated, "We hold this conference in order to speak out the truth and prevent the international community from being deceived and manipulated, so that the public can examine and make just judgment on Xinjiang issues in an objective, impartial and rational way."
Uyghur Tribunal'a hücum kıldıgan yığınlamı bar idi. Uyghur Tribunal'a hücum kıldıgan az degin 4 yığınla bolgan. Şu yığınlarda Xitayla xalqaradaki adamlarga rastlıkni bildirishimiz kerak. Uyghur Tribunalda bolayotgan gepler yalgan boldu deb çordiken Xitayla. Onun içinde mi tehditler var. Uygurlarga, başkalarga tehdit sal.
It is my personal belief, and others have stated this as well, when in the CERT in August 2018
Men özüm
made its comments, I think
2018'de Ceneva'da bolgan aşağıda Uygurlar, aşağıda Xitaylar Şarkı Türkistan'da lager pekit yok degen idi. Keyin onun baykenlikni
their discourse, reframe their discourse to respond to this changing international attention, which had previously for a very long time.
Hem mailinge mailum bolgandan keyin ularninki hikaye özgürüp ketdi.
August 2018 at the United Nations, so in a formal
Xitaylar unuğa mecburlab bolgan. Rahmet sizge. Lekin meniki yeni bir sorum bar.
I don't think that would have been a mistake if you refer to the
2018'de bolgan Xitay hikayesi
have been a mistake, as it was something that was repeated over time in various forums.
Xatalıktan kelgenmi ya belki ular bilmegen bo'lishi mumkinmi yoki boshqa bir sebepdan degin bo'lishi mumkin. Siz qanday deysiz? Yo'q, u xatolik emas, ular chuqur biletdi. Ular qasddan yolg'on gap qilgan edi deb o'ylayman.
Participating in a high-level meeting such as this UN CERD committee would have a country
Rahmet sizge.
And this country position would have been agreed by the capital. So
Benimki bilişimçe
this is the case here, and that therefore the delegation at the United Nations, in categorically denying the existence of the camps,
Birleşken Devletler'in teşkilatındaki çoğu yığınға qatnaşanlarning köpüncüsü çoğum bilimlik bo'lish kerak. Hem
Yes, thank you. That would definitely be my personal
merkezi bilen paranglashib bo'lgan bo'lish kerak. Shuning uchun sizningcha şu Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı yığınının aldida so'zlayotgan Xitaylar cho'qim Xitayning hukumatiningki pozitsiyasini bildirib bergenmi? Şundaq, meningcha şundaq. U hökümetninki pozitsiyasi bo'lgan edi. Rahmat. Siz yalğan guvalık to'g'riq paranglashdiңiz. Shuni to'g'riq ko'proq bizga tushuntirib berilamsiz? U odatda Xitoyda qandaq bo'lyapti? Masalan, uning ichidagi o'xshab ketgan omillar qandaq bo'ldi? Uningki yalğan, mecbur bo'lganligini qandaq bilasiz?
These practices have really regained momentum since 2013, since Xi Jinping came to power. Many organs have been involved in
Biz shundaq yalğan, mecbur guvalıqlarni ko'p tadqiqot qildik. U burunmi xalqaroninki diqqatiga ma'lum bo'lgan edi.
On CCTV in China, but some
Keyin
of them have also been broadcasted abroad.
Ashunaq guvalıqlarni yazgan
regulator Ofcom has
adamlardan xabarmi anglagan edik.
CGTN and sanctions CGTN over these practices, clearly stating that these are
Bizning ma'lumotlarning ko'pi chet elliklardan bo'lgan. Chunki chet elliklarmi ashundaq mecbur yalğan guvalık qilishga mecburlagan edi. Keyin Xitoydan chiqib bizga shu jarayonni tushuntirib bergan edi. Ularning deyishicha
basically a scenario that has been scripted for them. Now, in the case of televised confessions, they may also be
ashunaq yalğan guvalık keltirish uchun Xitoylar qiyin ish ishlatadi.
and especially when it comes to those
Hem tehdit soldi.
acquaintances of the overseas
Hem
witnesses.
ularninki
For example, those that have testified for the Uyghur tribunal, they are often in
qonlari yoki oila dikilarni ishlatib besim selib keltirdikan.
Statements or confessions made live in presence during the press conferences, either in Urumqi or in Beijing. However, I believe when one looks at these testimonies, and again we have 62 press conferences, 49 of them include these kind of witness testimonies. The similarity between the statements, the very close following of a script that is also immediately directly responding to an outside
Beijing ya Urumqida bo'lgan
sanctions that were just made, a statement by a government official abroad.
yalğan guvalık
To rebuke. And so we see a very clear script
biz
of what these people are saying.
ko'rgan guvalıqlar bilan 100% o'xshab ketmasimi?
So these are all signs that point to the fact that
Shu Uyg'urlarninki yalğan guvalık
so-called counter witnesses
larda
were heavily scripted.
so'zlari pek
We have not been able to interview any of these
o'xshab ketdigan. U cho'qim yezilgan bo'lishi kerak deb o'ylaymiz.
that these testimonies were staged, scripted.
Ondan bir necha odam o'xshash so'z ishlatsa, o'xshash gap qilsa, u cho'qim yozgan bir gap bo'lishi kerak deb o'ylaymiz. Biz albatta mush guvohchilarni ziyorat qila olmadik. Lekin guvohlikni ko'rgandan keyin ularning gaplaridan uning gaplarini anglagandan keyin cho'qim yolg'on bo'lishi kerak, cho'qim yezilgan bo'lishi kerak. Hem balki qiynishdan keltirgan bo'lishi kerak deb o'ylaymiz. Ma'qul, rahmat. Sizning analizingizda yana boshqa ispadlar bormi?
Yes, if maybe I don't know if it's possible to get the presentation up again. I put some an example statements, what we see very frequently.
Uyg'urlik burun yazgan bo'lsa-mu, mecbur bo'lishninki ispadı qanaq bo'ldi? Yeni başqa ispatlar barmı? Çoxum mecbur bo'lganligini ifodalaydiganmi?
Yes, for example, okay. So we see usually the intro starts with, there was bad influence by friends. They had a very poor level of Chinese. They were not good in their job, and they were kind of convinced by family members to sign up voluntarily for these educational trainings. Then, if we go on, they kind of describe often the conditions within the camp.
Adətdə muşu quvurluqlarınki mezmunu oxşab ketdi. Adamlar özü dostlarından az turğan bolduq deb turub xata yolğa menib boldim deb turdikan. Bularning gaplari yana oxshab ketgan. Masalan, mushushki eyleninki degan gaplari 100dan 100% oxshash bo'ldi ekan. Ular guvohlikni oxshamaydigan vaqtda bergan edi. Oxshamaydigan yerlarda.
Which I think anyone would find very difficult. There is another one if we go to the next slide. Just
oxshash bo'ldi ekan.
These last two statements here included are actually from the same person. They're the only ones that are from the same person. But they were made 4 months apart.
Ma 62 yig'inlarninki ichida 100dan 100% oxshash keldigan gaplar pek ko'p bo'ldi. Masalan, mushushki guvohliklarga qarsangiz, ma oxshash bir odamninki guvohligi lekin 4 oy farqliq bo'lgan guvohlik bo'ldi bir oxshash bir odamdan. Ularninki gap so'zlarimi oxshash keldi ekan. Oxshash bo'lgandan keyin u cho'qim o'zining kallaga kelib qolgan gaplar emas, burun yezilgan boshqalar yezib bergan gaplar bo'lish kerak deb o'ylaymiz.
Hello, thank you very much. Can I just start with a standard question? Can you tell us how the work of safeguard defenders...
Guvohlikning mezmuni oxshab ketdi, hem odatki odamlarning gaplariga o'xshamaydi yoki odamlar o'z qasddan xolancha so'zlasa ashunday gaplar hargiz chiqmaydi. Sizning pulingiz kimdan olasiz so'ramoqchi edim. Sizlarning tashkilotinglar nereden pul aldı?
Okay. When you say government bodies, could you just tell us which
Biz bir neçe hükümet teşkilatlardan pul alımız.
I am not sure I can publicly divulge this information. I am happy to present it though to the tribunal in writing.
Okay, thank you. Picking up on
Qaysi hükümet teşkilatlar? Unite problemsiz.
Similarities represent coercion. They clearly, without a doubt, represent.
Uni köpçülükün aldıda diyelmeymen. Men sizlarga keyin yezib beraman. Qaysi hükümetninki qaysi teşkilatlardan pul alamiz degan gapni hem köpçülükka diyelmeymen.
To effectively
ma'qul bo'ldi.
That they're taught, but do that voluntarily. Does it necessarily mean coercion?
Well, as I said, obviously we did not have the opportunity to actually visit or interview any of these people directly. So there is some
Sizningcha u guvohliklarning mazmuni yozilgan bo'lsa-mu, u cho'qim majburiy bo'lishi kerakmi? Balkim yozilgan bo'lsa-mu, ular o'zi qasddan, o'zlikdan yana o'qib bergan bo'lishi mumkin, shundaqmi? Ha, u balkim bo'lishi mumkin. Biz bilmaymiz qanchalik majburiyat, qanchalik majbur bo'lganligi. Lekin boshqa yolg'on guvohliklarda o'xshab ketadigan burunki guvohliklar ko'pinchisi o'zlikdan qilmagan, majbur bo'lgan. Mushu Uyg'ur qozaklarninki guvohliklarga qarsak, mazmunga qarsak, odamlarga qarsak, ular hargiz shunday gaplarni o'zlikdan qilmaslik kerak deb o'ylaymiz. Shuning uchun cho'qim hammasi bo'lmasa, ko'pinchisi majbur bo'lish kerak deb o'ylaymiz.
Recorded in interview also with the children of the second family. This was not broadcasted on CGTN. This CGTN broadcast was also used in one of these press conferences, and we have very strong indications there. We do have a direct testimony from one of the children that this was conducted under duress.
CNN'de chiqqan, keyin Xitoyning televizion instansiyasini Xitoyning televizion instansiyasi ularni yana qaytadan ziyorat qilgan. Mashki ziyorati faqatla o'xshamadi. Xitoy televizion instansiya qilgan ziyorati.
With regard to the comments made about this tribunal on the 25th of May, that you refer to, who do you think those comments are aimed at?
Oh, those comments, that was the biggest
Faqatla o'xshamadi. Shuni cho'qim majburlangan bo'lish kerak. Mashki balla hozir sirtimo, hozir aman bixeta bir yerdami? Yo'q. Ular hozircha Xitoyda, shuning uchun ularninki ismini demasam bo'larmikan? Ma'qul bo'ldi.
Uyghur tribunal. So it was very clear that this was aimed at discrediting them, maybe trying to silence them. I think the videos shown of their family members or acquaintances testifying against them, mirroring the accusations made by officials, to try and dissuade them maybe from testifying.
Uyghur tribunalda guvohlik berayotgan Uyg'ur qozaklarninki 14 adamlarni
with regard to witness intimidation, do you have insights as to where the
tanqid qildigan
come from? How far up the chain of
ularninki yomon gaplarni qildigan bir yermi bo'lgan edi?
I believe they are very centralized, and it's evidenced by the fact that since December 2020, so 1 year more or less after the start of these press conferences,
chet eldagi Uyg'ur qozak guvohliklarga tahdid selish uchun kim buyruq qilgan bilamsiz? Meningcha u eng yuqori o'rindan kelgan bo'lish kerak. Chunki Urumchida bo'lgan yig'inlardanmi?
Thank you. I've no more questions. I hand over to my colleagues.
Shundoq shuni qildigan odamlarni ko'rdik. U Urumchininki eng yuqori hukumatniki o'rinlarda
оралаштырып болған. Hem Beijing'de en yukarı orunlarda болған idi, aşındak yığınla. Meniki yeni başka sorularım var. Meniki başka sorularım yok. Meniki var.
I do think they are actually. There may be
very well. Information or information may be incorrect. Peter Humphrey gave a very interesting explanation of how false confessions can be
Mecburi guvalık bolsa mı? Adette soti işletmegen şundak mı? Yok, menimçe işletken bolsa mümkün. Makul. Peter Humphrey Efendi yalgan guvalık doğruluk.
Yes, sorry.
That's one way.
There are many ways of staging, let's say, the confession. People will be dressed up in a certain way.
Muhim geplerini kılgan idi.
Uyghur videos that we have seen very often, they will be placed in a setting, you know, of homeliness with Uyghur
bazı yerlerde
on the walls. Children will be playing around. I mean, there is a very clear extent of staging going on, which obviously is different in the press conferences where they participate in presence. So there's a bit of distinction.
But if you're still sitting in a cage, you're left in no doubt about what regime you're in. Peter Humphrey's case is quite interesting because it led
bazı
to
yerlerde aşındak yalgan guvalık kılsa adamını bir kepesinin içki silip
and Ofcom in this country has fined the China television company $200,000 in respect to that breach.
Uni televizyonda kögülü olmaydı o.
Right now on August 26th,
Kepesini kögülü olmaydı.
So for 3 counts of broadcast violation concerning 2 victims, Swedish
Şarkı Türkistan'da mı şundak bolgan mı? Belki şundak bazılar şundak bolgan boluşı mümkün. Kepesde oturup lekin kamera bilen kepesini kögülü olmaydı. Lekin bazılar mı öyde şundak yalgan videolarını koygan. Balsı yenide turup oynap turgan.
To bring these cases before the relevant bodies abroad, as victims may not
Yeni
be able to complaints can be filed. But those where complaints were filed, they have all been found guilty, yes.
And the tension is sometimes between organizations that are seeking to take the whole license of the China television companies away, in which case we'll have no information of any kind, corrupted or otherwise.
I think there are 2 things. So it also depends on national regulations.
Yalgan guvalık
lose its license
lana
so Ofcom ruled on that in February of this year because it
sotqa tartılgan. Şundak mı? Şundak. Bezle sotqa tartılsa, bezle Xitayni sotqa tartılgan idi. Hemisi de Xitay resmi guvalıkni mecburi hem sünni keltirgen boldu dep turgan idi.
So they now have their license there. However, there are investigations going on over there as well. For one case is the forced confession, the case of a child which I have referred to earlier.
Xitayning televizyonu meni qilsaqcha biz hech qanday ma'lumot ola olmaymiz, shundaqmi? Bu bo'lishi mumkin, lekin Angliyada CGTN'ni Xitoy televizion to'rini meni qilishning sababi u partiyaning butunlay partiyaning kontrolida bo'lgan edi. Shuni Angliyaning qonun bo'yicha bo'lmagandan keyin uni meni qildik.
Well, I think it is the typical what I've been trying to make clear, where they try to refute, to rebuke what's happening with these kind of direct testimonies. It's also, I briefly referred to the Uyghur Human Rights Report on these kind of forced televised confessions, the proof of live videos, which are used quite often, but which do not constitute, obviously, then also the people abroad actually get in touch. I think if I may say,
keyin yo'q bo'lib ketdi. Shuni to'g'liq ozroq so'zlab berlamsiz? Bo'ldi.
Weeks. And a second thing, what I find particularly worrying with regard
Ashuna guvohlik berganlarning ko'pinchisi keyin yo'q bo'lib ketishi mumkin.
Threatening people, tricking people into involuntary returns.
Yana lekin ularningki guvohliklarni yana ishlatildi. Ularni tuqqan sirtdagi tuqqanlar bilan aloqa qilolmay yo'q bo'lib ketsami, ularningki yolg'on guvohliklarni yana ishlatilgan partiyadan.
Put some disinformation out there. On the other hand, threaten or intimidate people, or maybe even coercing them, because I think many people are not coming forward, maybe coercing them in following that advice, going to the consulate, and possibly
Xitoy hukumatining deyishicha hammaylar o'ziniki Xitoyda bo'lgan tuqqanlar to'g'riq ma'lumot istasa Xitoy konsulxonaga kelsa bo'ldi. Lekin meningcha u hem yolg'on bo'ldi, hem xatarlik bo'lishi mumkin. Masalan, Uyg'urlar Osiyoga borsa, ularga xatarlik bo'lishi mumkin. Meningki boshqa savolim bor. Sizning misollaringizga qarasak, sizningcha
make sure that these press conferences are viewed in certain countries, for example? Thank you.
Xitoylar uni nima sabab bilan qildi? Sirtda bo'lgan yo ichida bo'lgan bir necha voqealar bo'lsa, bir xil voqealar shundoq yig'inlarni ko'proq keltiram ekan.
It's very clear,
Rahmat.
and it comes from the statements actually, that this is not a fixed schedule, but that they kind of try to respond to these.
Shu yig'inlarning
again, as I said, the Uyghur, the May
ko'p
25th one.
Shu yig'inlar ko'p bo'lgan bo'lsa-mu,
They actually talked before the actual event took place, but we see other ones. I think if we go from the very
ular bir jadval bo'yicha ma'lumot ekan.
They were expressing some news reports, especially a report by the New York Times. Then 1 month
Odatda chet tilda bo'lgan ishlarga qarab yig'in ochishgan.
1 month later, a couple of weeks later, we have the
Masalan, 2020ning 1-oyida ochgan yig'inda New York Times'ning bir necha maqolalarni mazmun qilib yig'in ochgan edi. Keyin Adrian Zensniki maqolasi chiqqandan keyin shuni to'g'riliqmi bir yig'in echilib bo'ldi. Yana Aspining report nashr bo'lgandan keyin yana bir yig'in echib tikkan.
May kind of fall upon, if they do research, may kind of find these kind of discourses, and so it does help to bring some doubt into the minds of less informed people or people that do not go as much in that. But as they say, expressing
uning neticesi qanday bo'lgan deb so'rasangiz, mash g'arbiy davlatlarda turayotgan odamlar uni balkim tushunib ketmasligi mumkin. Chunki ular uni ko'rmasligi mumkin. Lekin
conferences are broadcast.
Hem yig'inlarning mazmuni inglizchaga tarjima qilgandan keyin sirtda hamma e'lon o'qib olgandan keyin uning ta'siri xili eg'ir, xili cho'ng bo'lishi mumkin.
The press conferences are reported through radio, TV, foreign language websites and news apps in 15 languages.
Hozircha Beijingda bo'lgan 14
Malaysian, Turkish and Arabic with overall viewership
media yig'in
so far.
bo'lgan edi.
So it's very clear that it's aimed to reach at a global audience, not necessarily in countries where
Media
people
press
are more critical
media
of the
conference.
Chinese Communist Party. And I think it is linked in a way if we see also what
14 tillarda 14 tillarga tarjima qilgan
they will also clearly state, you know,
Neshr
so many countries spoke out
qilgan
in
edi.
favor
Shuning uchun
of China and our policies in Xinjiang. And I think many of
u
these
cho'qim
are the countries that they are actually aiming
sirtqa
to reach with
tarqatgan
conferences. And if I may use this time in
sirtdagi
this
chet eldagi medialar uchun
following this,
qilgan
what you
yig'inlar
will see from the
bo'lgan.
questions the foreign press is asking, and I think especially Western press, although they're
Boshqa davlatlarningki
questions, so I don't want to attack them on that, but I think it would be, I would like to invite them
yordami
actually
keltirish
not take
uchun
part
bo'lgan. Ya boshqa davlatlarningki
in this effort, which is in a way their mere presence is obviously seeking to legitimize in a way the discourse that
qo'llanishini keltirish uchun. Uning neticasi hozircha bo'lgan edi.
Witnesses abroad, I do not think any responsible media should be legitimizing this through their presence. Thank you.
Mr. Vetch.
I can't actually remember how many days after the closing of the hearings
Ba'zi sirtdagi odamlar ba'zi g'arbidagi odamlar uningga qatnashdi ekan to'g'rida. Menimcha ular qatnashmasa qatnashsa u Xitoyni qo'llandigandek ish bo'ldi ekan. Mening kichik savolim bor.
And I appreciate that there's a degree of speculation in this question, but do you have any observations about
so'zlayotgan cho'ng yig'in nereda bo'lgan edi?
Well, I would not know about the time exactly, but so we actually have 4 press conferences closely around the
Bek ko'p guvohliklar kelgan shu yig'inga, shundaqmi?
I said was the May 25th one, the preemptive one, where we had these 4
Ularni qandoq
counts of slander,
topdi?
I call them, I don't know what else to call them,
Nechilik
where we had
vaqtda
actually
topdi
extensive family video testimonies.
deysiz?
So I would say that they had been found, let's
Agar
say,
u guvohchilar erkin bo'lgan bo'lsa, shuncha ishda topolmasligi mumkin, shundaqmi?
This was held in Beijing. We then have 2 conferences held in
Biz
Urumqi
ular
on the
tepishga
9th of
nechilik
June,
vaqt ketganligini
again, with support of the
bilmaymiz.
Foreign Ministry of Beijing, a second of the 12th of June.
Balkim ba'zilarni burunmi topgan bo'lishi mumkin. Chunki
One more in Beijing.
ular sirtda chet eldagi
3 of these have these
guvohlik bergan Uyg'urlarningki tuqqanlar bo'lgandan keyin Xitoylar ularningki kim ekanligini, ne ekanligini burunmi bilgan bo'lishi mumkin.
Who rejected the so-called witnesses of the Uyghur tribunal, and here is exactly where we see
Yana 5-oyning 25-da bo'lgan bir yig'in bo'ldi. Uningdan keyin yana Urumchida, yana Beijingda yana bir yig'inda bir necha tuqqan yaddoshtlari chet eldagi Uyg'urlarning chet eldagi Uyg'ur guvohchilarni qilgan, ularning gaplari yolg'on deb qo'ygan.
just one question, if I may ask. In relation to these press conferences, do you ever do any psychological analysis of body language and the way that witnesses behave? And if so, what has that revealed about their state of mind?
G'aybatni qilgan edi, yolg'on gaplar qilgan. Shu sirtdagi uyg'ur qazaqlar to'g'ri.
But I know that others that may have that expertise or that maybe know the persons
Ashunaq yolg'on quvvatchilarni ularning gaplari bedanni psixologiya jihatdan analiz qilganmi? Yo'q. Men shuni to'g'riroq jiq ish bilmayman. Lekin meningcha boshqalar uni qilgan bo'lishi mumkin. Men bu anglaganki ularni tunoydigan yoki shu ishlarni yaxshi bildigan odamlardan anglasam shu yolg'on quvvatchilarningki bir aramlıqı pek eniq ko'ringan bo'ldi deb qo'ygan edi. Sizningki reportingizga ko'p rahmat. Bo'libmi Beijing bilan Urumchini selishtiradigan parça Amilbek muhim bo'lgan edi. Siz uni boshqa o'lkalarningki ishlari bilan selishtirsangizcha qanaqa bo'ldi?
Legitimacy, influence, and whatever they want to do. And there's various areas in terms of the international community.
Sizningcha shu yig'inlar, guvohliklar kim uchun qilgan?
The bodies such as the UN, the WHO, International Olympic Committees, there are various others, and it's intensified because of the Beijing Olympics.
Az sonliq millatlar uchunmi? Xitoyning ichidagi Xitoylar uchunmi yoki sirtdagi xalqaro ko'rmanlar uchunmi?
And the third are governments, and those governments are mainly those who have profits to earn from BRI investments, other kinds of engagements, and those who are thinking of trade who may not necessarily
Olimpikniki ishlari bilan qanday bog'lansiz?
Would I be correct in making
Hem
those kinds of areas
sirtdagi chet tildagi shirkatlar bilan qanday bog'lanliq bo'ldi? Bizniki o'zimizning hukumatlari bilan qanday bog'langan bo'ldi?
These particular press conferences, there are other targeted campaigns going on.
Ashunaq bog'lanish sizningcha bormi? Sizning reportingizdan shu ishlar chiqamdi? Bo'ldi. Meningcha shu yig'inlar ko'pinchisi chet tildagi xalqaro odamlar uchun qilgan keltirgan bo'ldi. Elbette oz sonliq millatlarni qo'rqitish uchunmi qilgan bo'lishi mumkin. Lekin shuni qilish uchun bek ko'p usullarni ishlatib turdi. Odamlarni qo'rqitish uchun Xitoyningki jiq strategiyasi bor.
Two more questions and then I think we're done.
Shuning uchun mushu yig'inlarningki eng muhim niyati, maqsadi xalqarodagi odamlarga yolg'on aytishdir. Meniki yana bir axtiki savolim bor. Humphrey Appender.
Yes, exactly. it's one of the things we try to...
No need to be particular, but it's well known and sometimes publicized.
Humphrey appendemo.
Damage to personality and mental health simply from having been
Aşındaq yalğan guvalık bəgən idi, mecburluğun.
Yes, especially, yes, the trauma has been well described by the people that have gone through it. And if you allow that those being asked to speak out against their family members or relatives, I cannot imagine what that trauma must be like.
Ziyanlık bolğan. Şundaqmı onunğa? Şundaq.
Second question.
Onundan trauma çıxışı mümkün.
Evidence that people used to make public false confession are prepared for the process.
Bolubmu özünün tuqqanlarına, özünün tuqqanlarını tenqid qilish mecburlagan adamlarning ki psikik jihatdan bek ig'ir mesele chiqishi mumkin deb olaman.
At the press conferences about the tribunal.
Şu mecburiyet mecburdan usul urushdan yoki boshqa fizika qiyinishdan iborat bo'lmasa-mu, yana psikolog jihatdan bek ig'ir ziyon bo'lishi mumkin. Sırtdan ko'rinmaydigan
the Uyghur
ziyanlıqı.
Since we have various counts of them appearing in different press conferences, I think in this case in particular, obviously they would have been kept in certain conditions. And I think previously you referred to the fact that there were these proof of life videos or proof of life testimonies.
Bezli sırtdan qarasaq normal ko'rindikan, lekin sizningcha u balkim shu uzunroq plan bilan bo'lgan sebepdan kelgan bo'lishi mumkinmi? Masalan, ularni yolg'on guvohlikqa selishdan burun uzunroq vaqt yaxshiroq tomoq bergan bo'lishi mumkinmi? Ha, meningcha shundoq. Bu yolg'on guvohliklarni bergan odamlar cho'qim erkin odam emas. Cho'qim burunmi, keyinmi, ya turma, ya lager, ya hech bo'lmasa nazoratning ostida turayotgan odamlar edi.
To Beijing and participate in these press conferences. Obviously, we have no direct reply, but I think the overall evidence.
Biz bekçik işlerini bilmeymiz. Mesela ular neden Beijing'e keltirgen? Umu mecbur bo'lganmi? Ularni qandoq shuni qilishga mecburlagan? Qatarliq ishlar biz hozir aniq bilmaymiz. Lekin biz ko'rgan
Thank you very much.
isbatlarga qarsak
Witness.
ko'pinchisi cho'qim mecburlagan bo'lishi kerak deb olamiz.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence or being available to give evidence to the tribunal for your report in advance. Your evidence is now concluded.